The soldiers came through the market before the sun had fully risen, and the sound of their boots on the stone street was sharp enough to wake every sleeping bird in the square. Elira froze behind her flower cart, her hands still wet from the water she used to keep her roses fresh. She did not know why her heart was pounding so hard. She only knew that something beneath the folded cloth at the bottom of her cart had moved. She looked down slowly, careful not to draw attention, and saw a small shape shift again under the damp fabric. Then another, then a third. 3 tiny bodies pressed together, warm and trembling, hidden among the stems of white lilies she had cut only an hour before dawn. Elira's breath caught in her throat. They were pups, wolf pups, unlike any she had ever seen, with fur so pale it almost looked silver in the weak morning light. She had lived near the border of the wolf territory her whole life, close enough to hear the howls at night, close enough to know the old stories about the packs that ruled the northern hills. But she had never touched a wolf, never been this close to one, and certainly never expected to find 3 of them curled beneath her flowers like frightened kittens. A soldier's voice rang out across the square, deep and commanding. "Search every cart, search every stall. The king wants no corner left untouched." Elira's stomach dropped. King. The word alone was enough to make every merchant in the market straighten their backs and lower their eyes. She had heard whispers before, quiet ones passed between neighbors who thought no one else was listening, about a powerful alpha king who ruled the wolf packs of the north with a still and quiet strength that made even seasoned warriors nervous. She had never expected to hear his name shouted across her own market square on an ordinary morning. She reached down without thinking and adjusted the cloth over the pups, tucking it gently around their small shivering bodies. One of them let out the faintest whimper, barely louder than a breath, and Elira's fingers brushed against fur so soft it felt like touching a cloud. She pressed a finger lightly to her lips, as if the pup could somehow understand her, and to her surprise, it went quiet. "Stay calm," she whispered, so softly that even she barely heard herself. "Stay still, little ones. I will not let them find you." She did not know why she said it. She did not know these pups. She owed them nothing. And yet something in her chest tightened at the thought of soldiers pulling them out from under her flowers, and doing whatever it was soldiers did with creatures they were hunting. She had grown up poor, raised by a mother who sold bread until her hands cracked from the cold, and if there was one thing her mother had taught her, it was this: the small and the frightened deserve protection, even when protecting them costs you everything. The soldiers moved closer, stall by stall, flipping over baskets of fruit, pushing aside sacks of grain, questioning merchants in short, clipped sentences. Elira watched them approach and forced her hands to keep working, arranging her flowers as if nothing in the world was wrong. She hummed a tune under her breath, an old song her mother used to sing while kneading dough, and she hoped it sounded natural, hoped her voice did not shake the way her knees were shaking beneath her long skirt. A young soldier stopped in front of her cart. He was tall, with sharp eyes that swept over her roses, her lilies, her buckets of water, and finally settled on her face. "Flowers," he said, more to himself than to her. "Fresh from this morning," Elira answered, keeping her voice light. She lifted a small bundle of white lilies toward him, the very ones that sat just above where the pups were hidden. "Would you like to bring some home to someone? A wife, perhaps? Flowers make even the hardest day feel softer." The soldier's eyes flicked to the lilies, then back to her face. For a moment, Elira thought her heart might stop entirely. She kept her smile steady, kept her hands from trembling, kept her eyes locked on his, as if she had nothing at all to hide. "No time for flowers today," he said finally, and turned to move toward the next stall. Elira exhaled slowly, careful not to let the breath shake as it left her. She glanced down again at the cloth, at the tiny shapes beneath it, and felt the pups' hearts beating fast against her fingers, where she still rested her hand near them, as if her touch alone could calm the storm racing through their small bodies. The soldiers continued their sweep of the market for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 30 minutes. They overturned crates, questioned old women selling cheese, demanded answers from a fisherman whose cart smelled of the sea. Elira watched it all from behind her own stall, her fingers busy with flowers, her mind racing with questions she dared not ask aloud. What had these pups done to deserve a hunt like this? Why would a king send his soldiers into a human market at dawn, searching so desperately, so thoroughly, as if the fate of his entire kingdom depended on what they found. When the soldiers finally moved on, marching toward the eastern edge of the square, Alira allowed herself a long, shaking breath. She looked down at the cloth again, and lifted a corner just enough to see 3 pairs of eyes staring back up at her. They were young, younger than she had first thought, their eyes still holding the soft blue color that she had heard young wolves carried before their true eye color settled in. One of them, the smallest, reached out a tiny paw toward her hand, as if asking for comfort. "You are safe now," Alira murmured, though she knew the danger was far from over. For now, at least. She could not simply leave them there. She could not report them, not after seeing the desperation in the soldiers' eyes, not after feeling how small and helpless the pups were beneath her palm. And she could not abandon her cart either, not when the day's earnings meant the difference between eating dinner and going without. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She continued her work, keeping the pups hidden beneath the flowers, moving through the market as if it were any other day, greeting customers with the same warm smile she always wore, even as her heart hammered against her ribs with every step. The market slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Merchants called out prices. Children ran between stalls chasing each other with sticks pretending to be swords. The smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery, mixing with the sweet scent of Alira's flowers. For a moment, it almost felt like an ordinary day again, except for the constant, quiet awareness pressing at the back of Alira's mind that 3 tiny lives depended entirely on her ability to stay calm. A woman approached her cart. An older neighbor named Greta, who lived 2 streets from Alira's small home. Greta had known Alira since she was a child, had watched her grow from a barefoot girl chasing chickens to a young woman who ran her own flower business with quiet determination. "You look pale today, dear," Greta said, eyeing her carefully. "Did those soldiers frighten you?" "A little," Alira admitted, forcing a small laugh. "I have never seen so many soldiers in one place." Greta shook her head, glancing toward the direction the soldiers had gone. "Something terrible must have happened up in the wolf territory. My nephew said he heard the palace bells ringing before dawn, the kind they only ring when something has gone very wrong." Alira's hand tightened slightly around the cloth covering the pups. "Do you know what happened?" "No one knows for certain," Greta said, lowering her voice as if the very words were dangerous to speak aloud. "But there are rumors. They say the king's own pups have gone missing. Taken, some say, right from the palace nursery." Alira felt the blood drain from her face, though she fought to keep her expression neutral. She glanced down at the 3 small shapes hidden beneath her flowers, at the pale silver fur, at the delicate paws, at the eyes that had looked up at her with such trust only moments before. Royal pups. The king's own children, stolen from the safety of his palace, and somehow, impossibly, ending up hidden beneath a poor flower seller's cart, in the middle of a human market square. "That is terrible," Alira managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt inside. "I hope they find them safely." "As do I," Greta said, shaking her head sadly. "A king without his heirs is a king surrounded by enemies. There will be trouble in the northern hills if those pups are not found soon. Mark my words." Greta moved on to another stall, leaving Alira alone with her thoughts and the weight of what she now carried. Trouble. The word settled heavily in her chest. She had thought, perhaps, that she was simply hiding 3 frightened animals from soldiers who wanted to harm them. She had not considered that she might be standing at the very center of something far larger, something that could shape the fate of an entire kingdom. She thought about turning the pups over to the next soldier who passed, about ending this dangerous game before it grew any more complicated. But then she looked down again, and the smallest pup lifted its head and let out the softest whimper she had ever heard, a sound so full of fear and exhaustion that it broke something open in her chest. She could not do it. She could not hand 3 frightened little ones, wolf or otherwise, over to strangers with cold eyes, not without knowing for certain that they would be safe. The morning stretched into afternoon. Alira sold her flowers one by one, bouquet by bouquet, keeping half an eye on the crowd at all times, watching for any sign of soldiers returning, any hint that someone might have noticed the way she guarded her cart a little too carefully, or the way she flinched every time a stranger walked too close. By midday, the pups had grown restless. She could feel them shifting beneath the cloth, could hear the faintest sounds of small claws scraping gently against the wood of her cart, She worried they might try to climb out, might reveal themselves at the worst possible moment, in front of the wrong eyes. She began speaking to them quietly, whenever she had a free moment between customers. Soft words, meant only for their ears. Promises that she would find a way to keep them safe. That she would figure out what to do once the market day ended. Just a little longer, she whispered, arranging a fresh bundle of violets to hide the gap where the cloth had shifted. Just hold on a little longer, and I promise I will find somewhere safe for you. She did not know if the pups understood her words, but something in their small bodies seemed to settle slightly each time she spoke, as if her voice alone carried some measure of comfort. She wondered, briefly, if wolves could sense honesty in a person's tone, if they could tell the difference between someone who meant them harm and someone who did not. She hoped, desperately, that they could tell she meant them no harm at all. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the market grew busier, filled with the usual chaos of a normal day. Merchants shouted over one another, advertising their goods. Children laughed and played near the fountain in the center of the square. A group of musicians began playing near the bakery, filling the air with a cheerful, lively tune that seemed entirely out of place, given the fear still churning in Alira's stomach. She sold bouquet after bouquet throughout the day, her basket of coins slowly filling, though her mind remained elsewhere, constantly aware of the small, fragile lives hidden just beneath her hands. She thought about her home, small and modest but private, tucked away on a quiet street where few people ever passed. She thought about the extra room she kept mostly empty, the one that had once belonged to her mother before she passed. Perhaps, she thought, she could hide the pups there for a night, just long enough to think clearly, to decide what to do next. But even as she made her plans, a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her of what Greta had said. A king without his heirs is a king surrounded by enemies. If these truly were the missing royal pups, then somewhere out there, an entire kingdom of wolves was searching for them, desperate and afraid. And if the wrong people found them first, whoever had taken them in the first place, the consequences could be far worse than anything Alira could imagine. She glanced down at the cloth one more time, watching the gentle rise and fall of small breaths beneath the fabric, and made a quiet decision. She would protect them, for now, however she could. She would figure out the rest as it came. She had faced hardship before, had built her small flower business from nothing after her mother's passing, had learned to survive on her own wit and determination when the world had given her little else. She could face this too, whatever this turned out to be. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, the crowd in the market began to thin, merchants packing away unsold goods, children being called home by tired parents. Alira had only a handful of bouquets left, a mixture of roses, lilies, and violets, arranged carefully in the front section of her cart, far from where the pups still lay hidden. She began preparing to close up for the day, her thoughts already turning toward the walk home, toward the difficult decisions that awaited her once she reached the privacy of her own house. That was when she noticed him. A tall figure stood near the edge of the square, half hidden beneath the shadow of a large gray hood that covered most of his face. He was not moving through the market the way most customers did, browsing casually from stall to stall. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his attention fixed entirely on her cart, on her flowers, in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. Alira told herself it was nothing, that plenty of people paused to admire her flowers before deciding to buy. But something about the stillness of this stranger felt different, deliberate, as though he were not looking at the flowers at all, but at something hidden beneath them. She felt a cold trickle of fear slide down her spine as she watched him take a slow step forward, then another, moving toward her cart with the quiet, controlled grace of someone who was used to being obeyed. She straightened her back, forced a pleasant expression onto her face, and prepared to greet whatever customer approached, even as every instinct in her body screamed that this was no ordinary customer at all. Before the hooded stranger could reach her, however, a commotion broke out near the fountain at the center of the square. A group of soldiers had returned, moving swiftly through the crowd with renewed urgency, their captain barking orders that carried clearly across the open space. Widen the search. Check every wagon leaving the square before nightfall. No cart, no basket, no barrel goes past the gates unchecked. Alira's pulse spiked painfully. Nightfall was still hours away, but the thought of her cart being stopped and searched at the city gates filled her with a fear so sharp it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. She had planned to wheel her cart home the same way she did every evening, through the western gate, and down the winding path toward her small house. If the soldiers meant to search every cart leaving the square, she would have no way to hide 3 living, breathing pups from eyes trained to notice exactly the kind of thing she was hiding. She glanced down at the cloth, willing the pups to stay silent, to stay still, as if her thoughts alone could reach them. To her relief, they remained quiet, pressed together in the small space beneath the flowers, perhaps sensing somehow that danger was near. The hooded stranger, whoever he was, seemed to notice the commotion as well. He paused mid-step, turning his head slightly toward the soldiers, and for a brief moment, Elira caught a glimpse of his jaw beneath the shadow of his hood, set tight, a muscle flickering there, as though he were holding back something powerful. Then he continued forward, unhurried, as if the soldiers meant nothing to him at all. Elira busied her hands with her flowers again, rearranging bouquets that did not need rearranging, anything to keep herself from staring too long at the approaching figure. She could feel Greta watching from 2 stalls away, could feel the curious glances of other merchants who had noticed the strange, quiet way the tall man carried himself through a crowd that parted for him without seeming to realize why. A young boy ran past her cart, laughing, chasing a stray dog that had wandered into the square. In his excitement, he bumped hard against the side of her cart, jostling the wheels, and nearly knocking over a bucket of water. Elira reached out instinctively to steady the cart, and in doing so, the corner of the cloth slipped just enough to reveal a small silver paw poking out from beneath the lilies. Her heart stopped entirely. She moved quickly, tucking the cloth back into place before anyone could notice, her hands trembling now despite her best efforts to remain calm. She glanced up, terrified that someone had seen, and found herself looking directly into the eyes of the hooded stranger, who had stopped only a few paces from her cart. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elira's mind raced through every possible explanation she could offer, if he had seen what she had seen, if he somehow knew what lay hidden beneath her flowers. But the stranger said nothing about it. Instead, his gaze lingered on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through every careful lie she had told all day. "You seem nervous," he said at last. His voice was low and even, carrying a quiet authority that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the soldiers who had marched through the market that morning. "It has been a long day," Elira replied, keeping her tone light despite the pounding of her heart. "The soldiers frightened half the market. I imagine everyone looks a little nervous today." The stranger's eyes remained on her a moment longer before drifting, almost lazily, toward her cart. Elira felt every muscle in her body tense as his gaze swept over the arrangement of flowers, lingering just slightly too long near the lilies where the pups lay hidden. "Beautiful flowers," he said finally, and something in his voice had shifted, grown softer, though no less watchful. "Did you grow them yourself?" "I did," Elira said, grateful for a question she could answer honestly. "I have a small garden behind my house. I grow what I can and buy the rest from a farmer outside the city walls." The stranger nodded slowly, though his eyes had not left the cart. "You must love them very much, to keep them so well tended." "I do," Elira said. "Flowers do not ask for much, only water, sunlight, and a little patience. And it is easy to love something that asks so little in return." For the first time since he had approached, the stranger's mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Patience," he repeated quietly, as though tasting the word. "A rare virtue, in times like these." Before Elira could respond, the sound of marching boots grew louder again, closer this time, and both of them turned to see a pair of soldiers approaching from the eastern side of the square, moving directly toward her cart. Elira's stomach twisted violently. This was it, she thought. This was the moment everything would fall apart. But to her astonishment, the hooded stranger stepped smoothly to the side, positioning himself between Elira's cart and the approaching soldiers, his tall frame blocking their direct line of sight to the flowers. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice carrying a new edge of command that Elira had not heard in him before. The soldiers slowed their approach, exchanging a brief, uncertain glance. "We are searching every cart leaving the square today, sir. Orders from the palace." "This cart is not leaving yet," the stranger said smoothly. "The flower seller and I are still discussing a purchase. I would hate for your search to disturb such delicate merchandise before I have made my selection." The soldiers hesitated, glancing at each other again, clearly unsure how to respond to a stranger who spoke with such quiet, unshakable authority. After a moment, one of them nodded stiffly. "Very well, sir. We will return once your business here is concluded." They turned and marched away, moving toward the next stall, leaving Elira staring at the hooded stranger with a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. No ordinary customer spoke to armed soldiers in such a manner, and certainly no ordinary customer received such immediate, unquestioning obedience in return. "Thank you," she said carefully, unsure whether gratitude or caution was the wiser response. "That was kind of you." Was it kindness, the stranger murmured, almost to himself, or simply good timing? Elira did not know how to answer that. She studied him more closely now, trying to catch a better glimpse of his face beneath the shadow of his hood, but he kept his head tilted just enough to keep his features hidden. There was something about him, though, some quiet, coiled strength beneath his calm exterior, that reminded her uncomfortably of the wild animals she had occasionally seen at the edge of the forest, creatures that moved slowly and deliberately, because they knew, without question, that nothing around them posed any real threat. "I should finish closing my cart," Elira said, glancing nervously toward the direction the soldiers had gone. "The day is nearly over, and I still have a walk home ahead of me." "Before you do," the stranger said, and something in his tone made her go very still, "I believe I would like to buy your flowers." "All of them?" Elira blinked, certain she had misheard him. "All of them?" "Every bouquet," he confirmed, reaching into a pouch at his side and producing a small handful of coins that gleamed far too brightly to belong to an ordinary customer. "Name your price, and I will pay it twice over." Elira stared at the coins, then at the stranger, her mind spinning with questions she did not dare ask aloud. No one bought an entire cart of flowers on a whim, and certainly no one offered to pay double without even glancing at the total cost first. Every instinct she possessed told her that this man wanted something far more than flowers, and as her eyes drifted once more toward the cloth, hiding 3 small, trembling lives beneath the lilies, a cold and certain understanding began to settle over her. He knew. She did not know how, or since when, but somehow, this stranger standing before her with his calm voice and his too generous offer knew exactly what she was hiding, and he had no intention of leaving the market square without it. Elira's hands went still on the edge of her cart. The coins the stranger held caught the last light of the afternoon, and for a moment she could think of nothing except how easily he had offered double the price without so much as glancing at what he was buying. No merchant behaved this way. No ordinary man walked through a market square with soldiers stepping aside for him and a pouch full of coins that gleamed like they had never touched a poor man's palm. "Twice the price seems generous for flowers. You have not even counted," she said carefully, forcing her voice to stay light, even as her thoughts raced in a dozen directions at once. "I am not a man who haggles over small things," the stranger replied. "When I want something, I take the fastest path to having it." There was a weight to the way he said it, as though the words carried more meaning than the simple exchange of coins for flowers. Elira studied him again, searching for any hint of his intentions, in the small sliver of his face visible beneath the hood. His jaw was strong, his skin sun-weathered in a way that spoke of long days spent outdoors, rather than lounging in some soft palace chamber. His hands, she noticed now, were not the smooth hands of a nobleman. They were scarred, calloused, hands that had held a sword more often than a coin purse. "I only have a few bouquets left," she said slowly, buying herself time to think. "Roses, lilies, and a small bundle of violets. It is hardly worth traveling far to purchase." "Then it should not trouble you to sell them all to me," he said, and though his tone remained calm, there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it now, the voice of a man unused to being refused. Elira glanced past him toward the direction the soldiers had gone. They would return soon, exactly as he had told them, and when they did, they would search her cart with the same thoroughness they had shown every other stall in the market. If this stranger truly knew what lay hidden beneath her flowers, then perhaps buying them all was not a threat at all, but something else entirely. Perhaps it was the only way to get the pups out of the square without a single soldier ever laying eyes on them. "Very well," she said, deciding in that instant that whatever this man's intentions were, She had little choice but to see where this strange exchange led. All of it, then. Though I must warn you, some of the lilies are already beginning to wilt. I am not concerned with wilting, he said, and something in his voice, low and quiet, almost sounded like relief. He placed the coins in her open palm, far more than any honest price could have demanded, and closed her fingers gently around them with his own. His touch was warm, startlingly so, warmer than any human hand she had ever felt, and for a brief moment, Elira wondered, absurdly, if he might be running a fever. I will need to carry the flowers myself, she said quickly, pulling her hand back and tucking the coins into the pouch at her waist. The stems are delicate. I would not want them damaged before you reach wherever you intend to take them. Of course, the stranger said. Then allow me to help you push the cart. It is the least I can do, having just emptied it of every flower you had left to sell. Elira hesitated. The offer sounded reasonable enough, even kind, but every instinct in her body told her that this man wanted far more than to simply carry flowers to wherever he was going. Still, she could think of no polite way to refuse him, not when he had just paid triple what her entire day's earnings would normally have brought, and not when the soldiers were still moving through the square, close enough that raising a scene now would draw far more attention than she could afford. If you insist, she said finally, stepping aside to let him take hold of the cart's worn wooden handles. As his fingers closed around the wood, Elira noticed him go very still, his entire body tensing the way a hunting animal tenses the instant it catches a scent on the wind. His nostrils flared slightly beneath the shadow of his hood, and his eyes, still hidden from her but clearly fixed on the cart, seemed to bore into the very spot where the pups lay hidden. Something wrong? Elira asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. No, he said, though his voice had changed, roughened, carrying an emotion she could not quite name. Nothing is wrong. Let us walk. They moved together through the thinning crowd of the market square, Elira keeping pace beside him as he pushed the cart with a strength that seemed almost too effortless for its weight. She noticed the way merchants glanced at him as they passed, the way conversations seemed to quiet slightly in his presence, though none of them appeared to recognize him outright. It was as though his very presence commanded a kind of instinctive respect, the sort that had nothing to do with fine clothing or a recognizable face, and everything to do with something far older and far more primal. You have not told me your name, Elira said, partly to fill the uncomfortable silence, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know who this man was. Draven, he said after a brief pause, as though weighing whether to share even that much. And yours? Elira, she replied. Though I suppose you already knew that. You have been watching my cart for quite some time before you approached. His head turned slightly toward her, and though she still could not see his eyes clearly, she felt the full weight of his attention settle on her like a physical touch. You noticed that. It is difficult not to notice a man standing perfectly still in the middle of a busy market, staring at nothing but a cart of flowers, Elira said. Most customers browse. You watched. I had my reasons, he said simply, offering nothing further. They continued walking, passing beneath the tall stone archway that marked the western edge of the market square, the sounds of the crowd fading gradually behind them as they moved onto the quieter streets that led toward the residential district where Elira lived. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, and for a while neither of them spoke, the only sound between them the soft creak of the cart's wooden wheels against the uneven stones. May I ask you something? Elira said finally, unable to hold back her curiosity any longer. You may ask, Draven said. I make no promise to answer. Why did you buy every flower I had? You have shown no interest in actually looking at them, smelling them, or even holding them since you paid. Most people who buy flowers at least want to see what they have bought. Draven was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed straight ahead as they walked. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost gentle. Perhaps I bought them for what they were hiding, rather than for the flowers themselves. Elira's steps faltered slightly, though she forced herself to keep walking, keep her expression calm, even as her heart began to race. I do not understand what you mean. I think you do, Draven said, turning his head toward her at last, and in the golden light of the setting sun, she finally caught a clear glimpse of his eyes beneath the hood. They were a striking shade of amber, almost gold, with a depth to them that felt far older, and far wearier than the rest of his face suggested. "You have been very brave today, Alira. Braver than you perhaps realize." Her mouth went dry. "Brave how?" "You hid 3 frightened creatures from an army of soldiers for an entire day, without flinching, without breaking, even when your own safety was at risk," he said quietly. "That takes a courage most people do not possess." Alira stopped walking entirely, forcing him to halt the cart beside her. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This whole time, you knew what was hidden beneath my flowers." "I have known since the moment I stepped close enough to catch their scent," Draven admitted. "Wolves recognize their own blood, Alira, even beneath a mountain of lilies and roses." The pieces began to fall into place in Alira's mind, with a speed that left her slightly dizzy. The soldiers searching so desperately, the rumors Greta had shared about missing royal pups, the way this stranger had commanded soldiers to stand down with nothing more than a few quiet words, the warmth of his hands, the strange primal stillness that had unsettled her from the very first moment she noticed him watching her cart. "You are the king," she said slowly, the words feeling strange and enormous in her mouth. "The Alpha King. Everyone in the market was so afraid of this morning." Draven's expression did not change, but something in his amber eyes softened, grew heavier, with an emotion that looked almost like exhaustion. "I am," he said quietly, "and beneath your flowers, hidden by your kindness and your quick thinking, are my own children, my heirs, taken from my palace nursery sometime before dawn, and until this very moment, I believed I might never see them again." Alira's gaze dropped instinctively to the cart, to the cloth still covering the pups, who had remained remarkably quiet throughout the entire walk. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and lifted the corner of the fabric, revealing 3 small, pale forms curled together beneath the wilting lilies. The moment the fading sunlight touched their fur, all 3 pups lifted their heads at once, and a sound rose from deep within Draven's chest that Alira had never heard a human voice make before, something between a gasp and a low, rumbling growl of pure, overwhelming relief. "My sons," he whispered, his composed, commanding presence cracking apart in an instant as he reached toward the cart with hands that trembled for the first time since she had met him. "My sons, you are alive." The smallest pup let out an excited yip and scrambled forward out of the flowers, tumbling directly into Draven's waiting arms, and for a moment, standing in the quiet golden light of the empty street, the powerful Alpha King of the northern wolf packs looked less like a ruler, feared across an entire kingdom, and more like any other father who had simply, desperately, needed to hold his children again. Alira watched the scene unfold before her, her own eyes stinging unexpectedly with emotion she had not anticipated feeling. Whatever came next, whatever dangers still lay ahead for her now that she had become entangled in the affairs of wolves and kings, she knew, with sudden, absolute certainty, that she had made the right choice that morning, hiding 3 frightened pups beneath her flowers, instead of turning them away. But even as relief washed over Draven's sharp features, Alira noticed his eyes lift briefly toward the empty street around them, scanning the shadows with the same wary alertness she had seen in him since the very beginning. Whoever had taken these pups from the safety of the palace was still out there somewhere, and something told Alira that the danger surrounding this small, fragile family was far from over. The other 2 pups climbed free of the cloth a moment later, one scrambling up Draven's arm to press its small face against his neck, the other tumbling clumsily to the cobblestones before catching itself and letting out a series of excited barks that echoed faintly down the empty street. Draven knelt without hesitation, gathering all 3 pups against his chest with an urgency that spoke of hours, perhaps an entire day, spent fearing the worst. "How did they come to be in your cart?" he asked after a long moment, lifting his gaze to Alira once more, though his arms did not loosen their hold on his sons. "I do not know," Alira admitted. "I found them there this morning, hidden beneath my lilies, before I had even finished loading the cart for market. I never saw who placed them there, if anyone did. Perhaps they hid themselves." Draven's brow furrowed, his amber eyes narrowing slightly as he considered her words. Pups this young could not have traveled far on their own, not without guidance. Someone carried them to your street, Alira, and left them somewhere they believed would go unnoticed. A chill crept over Alira's skin, despite the warmth of the fading afternoon. "You think someone chose my cart on purpose?" "I think it is possible," Draven said carefully. "And if that is true, then whoever took my sons from the palace may already know exactly where to find them again." The words settled heavily between them, and for the first time since the entire strange encounter began, Elira felt the full weight of just how deeply she had become entangled in something far larger than herself. She was no longer simply a flower seller who had shown kindness to 3 frightened pups. She was, whether she wished it or not, now a witness, a protector, and quite possibly a target. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Draven rose slowly to his feet, cradling the pups carefully against him, his expression shifting back into the calm, controlled composure she had first noticed in the market square, though something steelier had entered his gaze now, something dangerous. "Now, I make certain nothing else threatens them tonight. And I make certain nothing threatens you either, for the part you have played in keeping them safe. You owe me nothing," Elira said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them. "I only did what anyone would have done." "Few would have done what you did," Draven said, his voice quiet but firm. "Most would have handed 3 strange pups to the first soldier who asked, grateful to be rid of the danger. You chose differently, at considerable risk to yourself, without knowing who they belonged to, or why they were being hunted. That is not nothing, Elira. That is a debt I intend to honor." Elira opened her mouth to argue further, but the smallest pup chose that exact moment to wriggle free of Draven's arms and scramble across the cobblestones toward her, pressing its small, warm body against her ankle and letting out a soft, contented sound that felt remarkably like gratitude. She could not help the small, surprised laugh that escaped her as she bent down to scoop the pup gently into her arms. "It seems your son has already decided he likes me," she said, glancing up at Draven with a small, uncertain smile. Something shifted in Draven's expression as he watched her cradle his child with such easy, natural gentleness, an emotion crossing his features that Elira could not quite name, something between surprise and quiet wonder. "It seems he has," he murmured. "Wolves are rarely wrong about such things, even the very young ones." The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the empty street in deepening shades of orange and violet, and Elira found herself acutely aware of how quiet the world had become around them, how isolated this narrow stretch of road felt compared to the bustling chaos of the market they had left behind. She glanced instinctively toward the shadows gathering at the edges of the buildings, an uneasy feeling settling in her chest that she could not quite explain. "We should not linger here," Draven said, as though sensing the same unease creeping over her. "The streets grow more dangerous once darkness falls, and I would rather see both you and my sons safely behind closed doors before that happens." "My home is not far," Elira said, still holding the small pup against her chest, as she reached for her cart's handles once more. "Only a few more streets." "Then allow me to walk you the rest of the way," Draven said, and though his tone remained polite, there was no true question in it, only the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had already decided he would not be leaving her side until he knew for certain she was safe. Elira hesitated only a moment before nodding, and together they resumed their walk through the quiet streets, the empty flower cart creaking softly beside them, 3 small pups nestled safely in their arms, and the golden light of the dying afternoon giving way slowly to the deepening blue of an evening that neither of them yet knew held far greater dangers still waiting to unfold. Every few steps, Draven's eyes moved to the rooftops, to the mouths of alleys, to the darkening corners where the last light of day could no longer reach. Elira noticed the way his shoulders never fully relaxed, the way his hand hovered near his side, as though ready to draw a weapon that was not visibly there. She had grown used to caution during her years of walking home alone after long market days, but this felt different, sharper, the caution of a man who expected an attack at any moment, rather than one who simply preferred to be careful. "You keep watching the alleys," she said quietly, adjusting the small pup in her arms as it began to drift toward sleep against her shoulder. "Old habits," Draven replied, though his eyes did not stop their careful sweep of the surroundings. "A king who survives long enough to keep his crown learns never to assume a street is truly empty. Do you believe we are being followed?" "I believe it is wise to assume we might be, until I have reason to think otherwise," he said. "Whoever took my sons planned carefully enough to slip them past palace guards without raising an alarm until it was already too late. A plan like that does not simply end because the pups have been found. Elira's steps slowed slightly at the weight of his words. She glanced down at the pup sleeping against her shoulder, then toward the other two nestled in Draven's arms, and felt a fierce, unexpected protectiveness rise in her chest, sudden and surprising in its intensity. She barely knew these small creatures, had held them for less than an hour, and yet something about their trust in her, their instinctive comfort in her arms, had already carved a place for them in her heart that she had not expected. Who would want to harm them? She asked. They are only pups. Pups grow into heirs, Draven said grimly, and heirs stand between ambitious wolves and the throne they desire. There are those within my own kingdom, and beyond its borders, who would see my bloodline erased entirely, if it meant clearing their path toward power. That sounds like a lonely way to live, Elira said before she could stop herself, always wondering who around you might wish you harm. Draven glanced at her, something unreadable flickering behind his amber eyes. It is, he admitted quietly. Lonelier than most people realize. They turned onto a narrower street, lined with small, modest houses, their wooden shutters closed against the coming night, chimneys beginning to send thin trails of smoke curling into the darkening sky, as families settled in for their evening meals. Elira's own home stood near the end of the street, a small stone cottage with a garden gate that had not been oiled in months, its hinges creaking loudly enough to announce visitors long before they reached the door. This is it, Elira said, guiding her cart toward the narrow path leading to her front door. It is not much, but it has kept me warm and dry for many years. It is more than many wolves in my own kingdom can claim, Draven said, glancing around the small, tidy garden with an expression that held no trace of judgment, only quiet observation. As Elira reached for the gate, a sound from the street behind them made both of them freeze. It was faint, barely more than the shifting of gravel beneath a careful footstep, but Draven's entire body went rigid instantly, his nostrils flaring as he turned sharply toward the sound. Get inside, he said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding tone that left no room for argument. Now. Elira did not hesitate. She pushed through the gate, the pup still cradled against her chest, and hurried up the short path toward her front door, fumbling with the key at her waist as her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Behind her, she heard Draven's footsteps moving swiftly, positioning himself between her and whatever lurked in the shadows of the street. Who is there? Draven called out, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the very air around them still. For a long, tense moment, nothing answered except the distant bark of a dog several streets away, and the soft rustle of wind through the branches of a nearby tree. Elira finally managed to turn the key in her lock, pushing the door open, and stepping inside, though she paused in the doorway, unwilling to leave Draven alone outside, while danger might still be lurking nearby. Draven, she said softly, come inside. He remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the darkened street, searching the shadows with the focused intensity of a predator, certain that something had moved among them. Finally he exhaled slowly and turned, following her through the gate, and into the small warmth of her cottage, closing the door firmly behind him, and sliding the wooden bolt into place. It was likely nothing, he said, though his tone did not sound entirely convinced of his own words. A cat, perhaps, or a neighbor returning home. Still, I would rather be cautious than careless, especially tonight. Elira set the sleepy pup down gently on a folded blanket near the small fireplace, watching as it curled immediately into a tight, contented ball, its earlier fear seeming to melt away now that it was surrounded by warmth and quiet safety. The other two pups soon joined their sibling, tumbling over one another in their eagerness to settle close together, their earlier exhaustion finally catching up with them after a long, frightening day. You are welcome to stay a while longer, Elira offered, glancing toward the small window where the last traces of daylight were fading rapidly into true darkness. At least until you are certain the street outside is truly safe. Draven's gaze moved from the pups settling by the fire to Elira herself, studying her with an expression that seemed to weigh far more than simple gratitude. You have already given more to my family today than most would offer in a lifetime, he said quietly. I would not wish to impose further on your kindness. It is no imposition, Elira said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. I would not sleep peacefully tonight, wondering if you and your sons made it safely home. A faint, genuine smile touched the corner of Draven's mouth, the first true smile she had seen from him since their strange encounter began in the market square. "Then I will stay, if only long enough to ease your mind," he said. "Though I suspect it is my mind that needed easing far more than yours, after the day I have endured." Illyra moved toward her small kitchen, filling a kettle with water, and setting it over the fire to warm, grateful for the simple, familiar motions that helped steady her still racing thoughts. As the water began to heat, she found herself stealing occasional glances toward Draven, who had settled onto the floor beside his sleeping pups, one large hand resting gently across all three small, rising and falling backs, as though he could not quite bring himself to stop touching them, to stop confirming, again and again, that they were truly safe. "May I ask you something?" she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the small cottage. "You may," Draven replied, echoing his own words from earlier that afternoon, though this time, a faint hint of warmth had crept into his voice. "Earlier, you said someone within your own kingdom might wish to see your bloodline erased," she said carefully. "Do you have any idea who might have taken your sons, or why they chose to abandon them rather than harm them outright?" Draven's expression darkened slightly, his hand pausing its gentle motion across the pups' backs. "I have suspicions," he admitted, "but suspicion without proof is a dangerous thing to act upon, especially within a court as divided as mine. I fear that whoever planned this intended something far more calculated than simple harm. Perhaps they meant to use my sons as leverage, only for their plan to go wrong somewhere along the way, forcing them to abandon the pups rather than risk being caught carrying them." "And if that is true," Illyra said slowly, "then they may still be searching for the pups even now, unaware that you have already found them." "Precisely," Draven said grimly, "which is why I cannot simply return them to the palace tonight, not until I understand fully who among my own court can still be trusted." Illyra poured 2 cups of warm tea, carrying them carefully across the small room, and settling onto the floor beside Draven, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough to see the exhaustion finally beginning to show plainly on his sharp features, now that the immediate danger had passed. "Then stay here tonight," she said quietly, offering him one of the cups. "All of you. My home is small, but it is warm, and no one searching for missing wolf pups would ever think to look inside the cottage of a simple flower seller." Draven accepted the cup with a quiet nod of thanks, studying her over the rising steam, with an expression that had grown noticeably softer since the panicked, guarded man she had first encountered in the market square. "You continue to surprise me, Illyra," he said. "Most humans fear wolves. Most humans certainly do not open their homes to an alpha king and his sons on the very same day they meet him." "Perhaps I am not most humans," Illyra said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her own shoulders after such a long, strange day. "No," Draven murmured, his amber eyes lingering on her face in the flickering firelight. "I do not believe you are." They sat together for a long while after that, the fire crackling softly, the pups sleeping peacefully between them, and slowly, carefully, the conversation drifted away from danger and towards smaller, gentler things. Draven asked about her flowers, about how she had learned to grow roses that bloomed so late into the season, and Illyra found herself explaining, with more enthusiasm than she expected, the careful balance of soil and sunlight and patience that her mother had taught her years before. "My mother always said flowers were honest," Illyra said, watching the firelight dance across the surface of her tea. "They never pretend to be something they are not. A rose does not try to be a lily, and a lily does not try to be a violet. They simply grow as they are meant to grow." "A wise philosophy," Draven said quietly. "I confess, few in my court would understand such simplicity. Wolves are far more complicated creatures, forever measuring themselves against one another, forever hungry for more than what they already have." "Is that why you seemed so at ease, standing still in the market, watching everyone rush past you?" Illyra asked. "Because you understood, even then, how simple honesty could be?" Draven considered the question for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward his sleeping sons. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Or perhaps I simply recognized, the moment I caught their scent beneath your flowers, that whatever I found in that market square would change everything that came after. I did not expect to find such an unusual woman as well." Elira felt warmth rise into her cheeks, though she quickly busied herself with refilling their cups, unwilling to examine too closely the strange flutter that his words had stirred within her chest. It had been a very long day, she reminded herself. Exhaustion could make anyone's thoughts wander in unexpected directions. Far beyond the quiet cottage, in a part of the city where torches burned low along stone corridors lined with old portraits and older grudges, two figures stood speaking in hushed, urgent voices within a chamber that had not seen a servant's candle in hours. One of them paced the length of the room with barely contained frustration, boots striking hard against the polished floor. The pups were meant to be delivered before midday, the pacing figure hissed. Instead, they have vanished entirely, and now soldiers comb every street searching for them. If they are found before we can correct this failure, everything we have worked toward collapses. They will not be found easily, the second figure replied, calmer, though a thread of tension ran beneath the composed words. The one who carried them out of the palace was careful. No one saw where the pups were left. By now, they could be anywhere within the city, or beyond it entirely. That is precisely the problem, the first snapped. Anywhere means we no longer control the outcome. If the king finds them first, through no effort of our own, we gain nothing from this entire scheme, and we risk everything if our involvement is ever traced back to this chamber. The king searches like a man clawing through fog, the second said. He has no reason yet to suspect anyone within his own court. We still have time to correct our mistake, provided we act with more care than we did in choosing who to trust with the pup's delivery in the first place. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the faint hiss of the low burning torches along the walls. Finally, the pacing figure stopped, turning toward the shadowed corner where the second speaker remained hidden from the room's dim light. Find them, the first said, voice dropping into something colder, more dangerous than before. Find them before the king does, and this time, make certain there is no possibility of failure, whatever it costs. Whoever must be silenced to keep our purpose hidden. And if the pups have already been found by someone loyal to the throne? A slow, humorless smile spread across the pacing figure's face, though it remained hidden in shadow. Then we remove whoever stands between us and what rightfully belongs to our cause. No one is beyond reach. Not soldiers, not servants, not even a stranger who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Back within the warm, quiet glow of Elira's small cottage, entirely unaware of the cold calculations being made against them somewhere across the sleeping city, Draven finally rose to his feet, careful not to disturb his sleeping sons, as he stretched muscles stiff from the long, tense day. I should not stay too much longer, he said reluctantly, glancing toward the small window where the night had grown fully dark, stars beginning to scatter faintly across the visible slice of sky. The longer I remain away from the palace, the more questions will arise about my absence, questions I cannot yet answer safely. Will you take them with you? Elira asked, glancing toward the three sleeping pups, feeling an unexpected ache settle in her chest at the thought of the small cottage growing quiet and empty again. Draven hesitated, his gaze moving between his sons and Elira herself, weighing something carefully behind his thoughtful amber eyes. I do not believe the palace is safe for them tonight, he said slowly. Not until I understand who within my own walls betrayed us. If it would not trouble you too greatly, I would ask that you allow them to remain here a while longer, under your protection. Here, Elira repeated, surprised. You would leave your sons with a stranger you met only hours ago? You are no longer a stranger to me, Elira, Draven said quietly. You proved yourself today in ways few could have managed. I trust you with my sons more than I currently trust half the wolves within my own court. The weight of his words settled over her, heavy and significant, and though a part of her recognized the enormous risk such trust carried, another part of her, the same part that had refused to hand 3 frightened pups over to soldiers that very morning, felt a quiet, fierce determination rise within her chest. Then I will keep them safe, she said firmly, for as long as you need me to. Draven knelt briefly beside his sleeping sons, pressing a gentle kiss to each small head before rising once more, his expression a careful mixture of gratitude and reluctance at the thought of leaving them, even temporarily. I will return before dawn, he promised, moving toward the door. And Elira, should anything feel wrong tonight, anything at all, do not hesitate. There is a small silver whistle in my coat pocket, there, on the chair. One sharp blow, and every wolf loyal to my throne within the city will come running." He retrieved the whistle and pressed it gently into her palm, his warm fingers lingering against hers, for just a moment longer than necessary, before he finally stepped back, pulling his hood once more over his head, concealing the sharp, striking features that had grown so much more familiar to her over the course of one extraordinary day. "Be safe," Elira said softly, as he opened the door, letting in a rush of cool night air. "And you," Draven replied, glancing back at her one final time, his amber eyes catching the last of the firelight. "Guard them well, flower seller. You now hold something far more precious than you realize." With that, he slipped out into the darkness, and Elira closed the door quietly behind him, sliding the bolt firmly into place, before turning back to face the small, sleeping shapes curled peacefully by her fire. She sank down beside them, exhaustion finally overtaking her fully now that the danger of the day had passed, at least for the moment, and as she watched the gentle rise and fall of 3 small breaths, she could not shake the feeling that whatever came next would change the entire course of her quiet, simple life forever. Elira woke before dawn, to the sound of soft scratching at her front door. She sat up quickly, disoriented for a moment, amid the tangle of blankets she had pulled around herself, and the sleeping pups during the cold hours of the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint orange light across the small room, and beside her, all 3 pups stirred as well, lifting their heads toward the door with ears pricked forward. The scratching came again, followed by a low, familiar voice speaking quietly through the wood. "Elira, it is Draven." She rose quickly, crossing the room and sliding back the bolt, opening the door to find him standing in the pale gray light of early morning, his hood pushed back for once, revealing the full extent of his exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed his amber eyes, and a fresh scrape marked one side of his jaw, though he waved away her immediate concern before she could voice it. "It is nothing," he said, stepping inside as the pups scrambled excitedly toward him, tumbling over one another in their eagerness to greet him. A disagreement with a shadow that turned out to be nothing more than an overzealous guard patrol. "I am unharmed." "You do not look unharmed," Elira said, studying the scrape more closely as she closed the door behind him. "Sit. Let me clean that properly before it becomes something worse." Draven opened his mouth as though to argue, then seemed to think better of it, lowering himself onto the small wooden chair near her hearth, while she retrieved a clean cloth and a small jar of salve her mother had taught her to make from crushed herbs and honey. She worked carefully, dabbing gently at the shallow scrape, aware of how closely he watched her face as she tended to him, aware of the strange, comfortable silence that had settled between them despite everything that remained uncertain about their circumstances. "Did you learn anything last night?" she asked finally, setting aside the cloth once she had finished. Draven's expression grew serious again, the brief softness of the moment fading beneath the weight of the concerns he carried. "I spoke with a handful of guards I trust completely, men who have served my family for generations. None of them saw anything unusual before the pups vanished, which tells me the one responsible knew the palace well enough to move through it without raising suspicion." "Someone from within your own court, then," Elira said quietly. "That is my fear," Draven admitted, "and a fear I cannot yet act upon, not without proof. If I accuse the wrong wolf, I risk fracturing loyalties within my own pack, at precisely the moment I most need unity. Whoever did this understood that as well. They chose their moment carefully." Elira moved to prepare a simple breakfast, cutting slices of bread and setting out a small dish of butter, while the pups continued to weave excitedly around Draven's legs, clearly delighted by his return. She watched him lift the smallest one into his lap, scratching gently behind its ears, while it let out a series of contented, high-pitched sounds. "What will you do now?" she asked, setting a plate before him. "I must return to the palace this morning," he said, accepting the food with quiet gratitude. "My absence has already drawn enough questions. I cannot allow it to continue much longer without risking suspicion that something is deeply wrong." "And the pups?" Draven's gaze lifted to meet hers, weighing something carefully behind his tired eyes. "I would ask, if you are willing, that they remain here a while longer, perhaps several days, until I can be certain the palace is truly safe for them again." Elira set down the knife she had been using to slice bread, considering the enormous request being placed before her. Hiding the pups for a single day in a crowded market square was one matter. Caring for 3 royal wolf pups within her own home for days, perhaps longer, while their father navigated a dangerous conspiracy within his own kingdom, was something else entirely. "I have never cared for pups before," she said honestly. "I would not know how to keep them properly fed, or how to handle them if they grew unwell." "They are hardier than they appear," Draven said gently. "Wolves grow strong quickly, even as pups. They will need food, warmth, and companionship, all of which you have already given them freely since the moment you found them. I would not ask this of you if I did not believe, with complete certainty, that you are capable of it. And if someone comes looking for them here? If whoever took them from the palace learns where they have been hidden." Draven's expression darkened, though his voice remained steady. "I will leave guards nearby, discreetly, watching the street without drawing attention, and you will have the whistle I gave you, should anything feel wrong. I would not leave them here unprotected, Alira. I trust you, but I am not reckless with their safety." Alira studied the 3 pups now curled contentedly around Draven's feet, full from their breakfast and drowsy in the warm morning light filtering through her window. She thought of her mother, of the quiet cottage that had felt too empty and too silent in the years since she had been left entirely alone in the world, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the idea of the small space filling with the sounds of playful pups did not frighten her nearly as much as it should have. "Very well," she said finally. "I will keep them safe, for as long as you need." Relief flooded Draven's features, softening the tension that had gathered there since his return. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I will not forget this kindness, Alira. Whatever comes of this, I promise you that." He rose reluctantly a short while later, gathering his cloak and preparing to return to the palace, kneeling once more to press gentle affection upon each of his sons, before straightening to face Alira at the door. "I will send word when I can," he said, "and I will return the moment it is safe to do so. Until then, guard them well." "I will," she promised. He lingered a moment longer at the threshold, his amber eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "You have given me back something I feared lost forever," he said quietly. "I do not know how to properly thank a person for such a gift." "You already have," Alira said softly, "by trusting me to keep them safe a little while longer." A faint, genuine smile touched his lips before he turned and slipped out into the brightening morning, leaving Alira alone once more, with 3 small pups who had, in the span of a single day, become entirely, unexpectedly precious to her. The days that followed settled into an unusual but oddly comfortable rhythm. Alira continued selling flowers each morning, though now she left the pups safely hidden within her cottage rather than risking another dangerous journey through the crowded market square. She discovered quickly that Draven had spoken truly about their resilience, watching with quiet amazement as the pups grew steadily more playful and energetic with each passing day, their earlier fear fading into curious, boundless enthusiasm for every corner of her small home. The smallest pup, who Alira had begun affectionately calling Kale after noticing the small crescent-shaped marking near his ear, quickly became the boldest of the 3, forever the first to investigate new sounds or chase after fallen leaves that blew in through her open window. The second pup, calmer and more watchful, she named Wren, noticing how it often sat quietly observing everything around it before deciding whether to join in its siblings' games. The third, the largest of the 3, she called Briar, after the thick tangled bushes that grew wild along the edges of her garden, since he seemed to delight most in burrowing beneath blankets and cushions whenever he grew tired. Draven visited when he could, always under the cover of darkness, always careful to ensure he had not been followed. Each visit brought fragments of news from the palace, whispers of suspicion he had not yet been able to confirm, names he dared not speak aloud even within the privacy of Alira's small cottage. And each visit, Alira noticed, seemed to leave him a little more at ease, a little less burdened, as though the simple warmth of her home, and the sight of his sons thriving safely within it, offered him a rare moment of peace amid the growing storm surrounding his throne. On the 4th evening, as golden light spilled through her small windows, and the pups tumbled happily across a pile of old blankets in the corner, Draven arrived earlier than usual, his expression unusually thoughtful, as he stepped through her door. "You seem troubled," Alira observed, setting aside the basket of herbs she had been sorting. Not troubled, he said, though he lowered himself onto the chair near her hearth with unusual slowness. Only thinking. I have spent every visit here speaking of danger and suspicion, of court politics and hidden enemies. Tonight, I find myself wishing simply to sit quietly and watch my sons play, without the weight of the throne pressing so heavily on every word I speak. Then do that, Elira said simply, settling onto the floor near the pups, patting the space beside her. For one evening, leave the king outside my door, and let only the father remain. Draven's amber eyes softened at her words, and after a moment's hesitation, he joined her on the floor, stretching out his long legs, as Kale immediately abandoned his game to clamber into his father's lap. Ren followed more sedately, curling against Draven's side, while Briar continued burrowing determinedly beneath a blanket a short distance away, utterly absorbed in his own small adventure. You are good with them, Elira said, watching the easy affection between Draven and his sons. Gentler than I would have imagined, for a king so many fear. Fear is a useful tool for ruling a kingdom, Draven admitted, but it has no place here, in this room, with these three. They have known enough fear already, for pups so young. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, the pups gradually growing drowsy from their play. Elira found herself studying Draven's profile in the firelight. The sharp lines of his face softened now, by unguarded affection, rather than the careful composure he wore like armor everywhere else in his life. May I ask you something personal? She said eventually. After everything we have shared this week, I believe you have earned the right to ask me almost anything, Draven replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. Their mother, Elira said carefully. You have never spoken of her. Something shifted behind Draven's eyes, a flicker of old grief quickly masked, but not entirely hidden. She passed shortly after Briar was born, he said quietly. A fever that no healer in my kingdom could cure, though we tried everything within our power. I have raised them largely alone since then, with the help of nursemaids and guards, though none of it ever quite filled the space she left behind. I am sorry, Elira said softly. I did not mean to open an old wound. You did not, Draven assured her. It is strange. I have not spoken of her in a very long time. Not even within my own court, where such grief is often seen as weakness in a ruler. Yet here, in this small cottage, it does not feel like weakness at all. It simply feels like truth. Elira reached out instinctively, resting her hand lightly over his where it rested near Kale's sleeping form, and Draven did not pull away. Perhaps this cottage has a way of stripping things down to what they truly are, she said. Kings and flower sellers included. Draven turned his hand slightly beneath hers, their fingers loosely intertwining in the firelight, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet warmth of the small room saying far more than words ever could. Outside, the last light of evening faded fully into night, and somewhere beyond the walls of Elira's cottage, a figure moved carefully along the darkened street, pausing just long enough at the edge of her garden gate to note the faint glow of firelight through the shutters and the shape of a tall man's shadow within, before slipping away again into the darkness as silently as it had come. Neither Elira nor Draven noticed the watcher that night, too absorbed in the fragile, unexpected comfort growing steadily between them. But the following morning, when Elira stepped outside to fetch water from her well, she found a single, deep footprint pressed into the soft earth beside her garden gate, far larger than any print her neighbors might have left, and far too fresh to have been there the evening before. She stood staring at it for a long moment, an uneasy chill creeping through her despite the warmth of the rising sun, before hurrying back inside to check on the sleeping pups, her heart pounding with a fear she could not quite name, but understood, instinctively, that she could no longer ignore. Elira barely touched her breakfast that morning, her thoughts circling endlessly around the strange footprint she had discovered by her gate. She kept glancing toward the window, toward the small garden beyond it, half expecting to see a shadow lurking where none belonged. The pups, sensing her unease, stayed close to her throughout the morning, abandoning their usual games, in favor of curling quietly around her feet as she moved from task to task. When Draven arrived that evening, she led him immediately to the spot beside her gate, though the footprint had grown less distinct after a day of foot traffic and light rain. Still, enough of its shape remained for Draven to crouch beside it, his expression growing sharp and focused as he studied the impression left in the earth. This was made by a wolf, he said quietly, running his fingers lightly along the edge of the print. In human form, but a wolf nonetheless. The weight and the stride mark it clearly enough. Someone came here last night, Illyra said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. While we sat inside, someone stood right here, watching. Draven rose slowly, his gaze sweeping the quiet street with renewed wariness, the earlier softness of the previous evening replaced entirely by the guarded alertness of a king who understood, with sudden clarity, that his enemies had drawn closer than he had hoped. I should not have allowed myself to grow so comfortable here, he said, more to himself than to her. I let my guard down, and in doing so, I may have placed you and my sons in far greater danger than I realized. You could not have known, Illyra said, though the fear in her chest made the words feel thin and unconvincing, even to her own ears. I should have assumed it, Draven said grimly. Whoever orchestrated the theft of my sons would not simply abandon their scheme after one failed attempt. They have been searching, quietly, patiently, and it seems they have finally found what they were looking for. Illyra wrapped her arms around herself, glancing back toward the cottage where the pups waited, oblivious to the danger creeping steadily closer to the only safety they had known since the terrifying morning of their disappearance. What do we do now? Draven was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with the weight of a decision he clearly did not wish to make. I believe it is no longer safe for them to remain here, he said finally. Nor for you, Illyra. If they know where my sons are hidden, they will know that you have been protecting them, and that makes you a target, as surely as it makes them one. The full weight of his words settled over Illyra slowly, cold and heavy. She had understood, in some distant way, that danger surrounded the pups from the very beginning, but she had not fully considered that the danger might extend to her as well, might follow her into the quiet, ordinary corners of her own life that she had built so carefully after her mother's passing. What would you have me do? She asked. Come to the palace, Draven said, the words coming quickly now, as though he had been considering them for some time, before finally finding the courage to speak them aloud. Bring the pups, and remain there, under my protection, until I have rooted out whoever within my own court seeks to harm them. I cannot guarantee your safety if you remain here alone, not now that our enemies know where to find you. Illyra's breath caught at the enormity of the request. The palace of the Alpha King was not simply another house, another quiet street where she might continue her simple life undisturbed. It was a place of politics and power, of ancient wolf traditions she barely understood, of courtiers who would surely look upon a poor human flower seller with suspicion, or worse, outright hostility. I know nothing of your world, she said quietly. I would not know how to behave among wolves of noble blood, how to navigate whatever politics exist within your walls. I would be entirely out of place. You underestimate yourself, Draven said, his voice softening slightly, despite the tension still gripping his frame. You navigated soldiers and hidden dangers with remarkable composure, only days ago, without any experience in such matters at all. I do not believe court politics would prove so different a challenge for someone with your particular strength of character. And if your court resents my presence? If they see a human woman living within palace walls and question why, then they will answer to me, Draven said firmly, and they will learn quickly that questioning your place beside my sons is not a conversation I am willing to entertain. Illyra glanced back toward her small cottage, toward the modest life she had built there, the flowers she grew each season, the quiet routine that had sustained her since she was a young girl left alone in the world. Leaving it all behind, even temporarily, felt like stepping off the edge of everything familiar, into an uncertain darkness she could not fully see the bottom of. But then she thought of the 3 small pups sleeping soundly within that cottage, utterly dependent on the protection of the adults around them, unaware of the danger that had crept close enough to leave its mark in the soft earth beside her gate. She thought of the fierce, unexpected love that had grown within her heart over these past few days. Love she had not anticipated feeling for creatures she had known for such a brief time, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that she could not simply abandon them now, not when they needed protection more than ever. I will come, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty still churning within her. Whatever it takes to keep them safe, I will come. Relief and gratitude flickered across Draven's features, mixed with something else, something warmer and more complicated that he did not fully voice, though Alira caught the faintest glimpse of it in the way his amber eyes lingered on her face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise you will not regret this choice, Alira. I will see to your safety personally, for as long as you remain within my walls." They returned inside together, gathering the pups and the few modest belongings Alira could not bear to leave behind, moving quickly now, with the urgency of people who understood that danger, once glimpsed, rarely announced itself twice before striking. As Alira packed a small bag of clothing and personal items, she paused briefly beside the small shelf where her mother's old cooking pot sat, a simple, worn object that held more sentimental value than any treasure a palace might contain. "You may bring whatever you wish," Draven said gently, noticing her hesitation. "The palace has more than enough space for a few cherished belongings." Alira wrapped the pot carefully in a cloth and tucked it into her bag, along with a small collection of pressed flowers her mother had kept from years past, treasures that represented the only tangible connection remaining to the woman who had raised her. By the time she finished, the pups had gathered eagerly by the door, sensing the change in routine, and clearly excited by the prospect of a new adventure, blissfully unaware of the dangers that had prompted this sudden departure. Draven extinguished the fire carefully, ensuring no lingering embers might pose a risk to the empty cottage, before ushering Alira and the pups out into the cool night air. The street remained quiet, deceptively peaceful beneath a sky scattered thick with stars, though Alira could not shake the feeling of unseen eyes, watching from the shadows, as they made their way toward the edge of the city, where Draven had arranged for a covered carriage to carry them swiftly and discreetly toward the palace grounds. "How long will we need to remain there?" Alira asked, as the carriage began its journey, the pups settling contentedly around her feet, despite the late hour. "Until I am certain the threat has been fully dealt with," Draven said, his gaze fixed on the passing darkness beyond the small carriage window. "It may take weeks. It may take longer. I cannot make promises. I am not certain I can keep, Alira. But I can promise you this. Whatever time it takes, you and my sons will remain safe within my walls, guarded by wolves, whose loyalty I trust with my very life." Alira nodded slowly, watching the familiar streets of her modest neighborhood give way gradually to wider roads and grander buildings, as the carriage carried them steadily toward the towering silhouette of the palace, rising in the distance, its high stone walls catching the pale silver light of the moon. She thought of the market square where this entire strange journey had begun, only days before, of the ordinary life she had lived, before 3 frightened pups had hidden themselves beneath her flowers, and felt a quiet, unshakable certainty settle over her, that whatever waited beyond those palace walls, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through every difficult moment since. The carriage rolled to a stop before massive iron gates guarded by wolves in human form, their sharp eyes immediately softening with recognition and relief as they caught sight of their king and the small pups gathered safely around him. Whispered greetings passed quickly between the guards as the gates swung open, and Alira felt her heart quicken, with a mixture of anxiety and cautious hope, as the carriage rolled forward into the grand courtyard beyond, carrying her toward a new and uncertain chapter of a life that had changed irrevocably since the moment she found 3 trembling pups hidden beneath her flowers. The courtyard itself took her breath away despite the late hour, tall stone towers rising on every side, torchlight flickering warmly against ancient walls carved with images of running wolves and rising moons. Servants hurried forward the moment the carriage stopped, their eyes widening first with relief at the sight of the pups, then with open curiosity at the sight of Alira stepping down beside them, her simple traveling dress marking her clearly as someone unfamiliar to the grandeur surrounding her. "Your Majesty," a stern voice called out, and Alira turned to see an older man approaching briskly across the courtyard, his silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, his expression a careful mixture of relief and lingering worry. "Thank the moon above. They are truly safe." "Edric," Draven said warmly, clasping the older man's forearm in greeting. "Yes, safe, thanks entirely to the woman standing beside me." Edric's sharp gaze shifted toward Alira, studying her with the careful, assessing look of a man who had spent decades protecting a kingdom and had learned not to trust appearances too quickly. "A human," he said, not unkindly, though clear surprise colored his tone. "You found the young princes among humans, Your Majesty." She hid them from soldiers and enemies alike for an entire day, without knowing who they were or why they were hunted, Draven said, his voice carrying a firmness that left little room for doubt about his feelings on the matter. She will be staying within the palace, under my full protection, for as long as necessary. See that she is treated with every courtesy afforded to an honored guest. Of course, Your Majesty, Edric said, inclining his head respectfully toward Alira, though a flicker of something more complicated passed briefly behind his eyes, before he composed his expression once more. Welcome to the palace, my lady. I am Edric, chief advisor to the king. Please, allow me to see you and the young princes settled comfortably. As they moved through the grand corridors of the palace, torchlight casting long shadows across polished stone floors, Alira noticed the curious glances of servants and guards alike, whispers passing quickly from one to another, as word spread of the human woman who had saved the missing heirs. Not all the glances were kind. She caught the narrowed eyes of a young noblewoman standing near a tall archway, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, as she watched Alira pass, and further along, a broad-shouldered man with cold gray eyes, who studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle uncomfortably, though he said nothing, and offered only a stiff, formal bow, as Draven led her past. Who was that? Alira asked quietly once they had moved beyond earshot, glancing back briefly toward the corridor where the gray-eyed man had stood. Halden, Draven said, his tone carefully neutral, though something guarded entered his expression. A cousin of mine, and a respected commander within my personal guard. He has served my family faithfully for many years. He did not look particularly pleased to see me, Alira observed. Halden trusts few people easily, Draven said. He has always been protective of the throne's stability, sometimes to the point of suspicion toward anything unfamiliar. Pay him little mind. His loyalty to my sons has never once been in question. Alira nodded, though something about the memory of those cold gray eyes lingered uncomfortably at the edges of her thoughts as they continued through the palace. Edric led them eventually to a comfortable suite of rooms situated close to the royal nursery, explaining that Alira would find everything she needed within easy reach, and that guards would be stationed discreetly nearby throughout both day and night. The princes will sleep in the nursery as usual, Edric explained, though given recent events, I imagine you would prefer them close by for the time being, Your Majesty. For now, yes, Draven agreed. Have a small bed arranged within Alira's chamber for them, until I am satisfied that the nursery itself poses no further risk. Edric nodded and departed to arrange the necessary preparations, leaving Draven and Alira alone, within the elegant, spacious chamber that would serve as her new home, for however long her stay within the palace might last. Rich tapestries lined the walls, depicting scenes of wolves running beneath full moons, and a large window overlooked a moonlit garden, far grander than the small plot she tended behind her modest cottage. This is far more than I expected, Alira said, running her fingers lightly along the edge of a carved wooden chest positioned near the window. I feel as though I do not belong in such a room. You belong wherever my sons are safest, Draven said quietly, moving to stand beside her near the window. And right now, that is here, beside you. Alira turned to face him, studying the tired lines still etched faintly around his eyes, despite the relief of having his sons safely returned to the palace. Will you truly be able to root out whoever betrayed you? Halden seemed troubled by my presence, and I noticed others watching me with similar suspicion as we walked. Suspicion of an unfamiliar human is not the same as guilt in a conspiracy against my throne, Draven said carefully. I do not yet know who among my court orchestrated the theft of my sons, but I intend to find out, whatever it takes, and however long it requires. A soft knock interrupted them, and a young servant girl entered, carrying the pups carefully in her arms after having fetched them from the carriage, where they had briefly settled to sleep during the short journey through the courtyard. She set them down gently near the hearth, and immediately all three scrambled toward Alira, clearly seeking the comfort of her presence amid such unfamiliar new surroundings. They have grown quite attached to you, Draven observed, a faint smile touching his lips as he watched Kale climb determinedly into Alira's lap. As I have grown attached to them, Alira admitted softly, stroking Kale's soft fur while Wren and Briar settled close beside her. Draven lingered a while longer, discussing quietly the arrangements he intended to make for her safety and comfort within the palace, before finally taking his leave for the night. promising to return the following morning to begin the delicate, dangerous work of uncovering the truth behind his son's abduction. Elira settled the pups into their small bed near her own, extinguishing most of the candles scattered throughout the grand chamber, though she left one burning low near the window, unable to shake entirely the unease that had followed her from the modest cottage she had left behind. As sleep finally began to claim her, her thoughts drifted uneasily between the warmth of Draven's gratitude, the cold suspicion in Halden's gray eyes, and the single deep footprint pressed into the soft earth beside her garden gate, a quiet reminder that even within the grand guarded walls of a king's palace, true safety remained, for now, an uncertain and fragile thing. Morning arrived with golden light spilling generously through the tall windows of Elira's new chamber, and she woke to find all three pups already awake, tumbling energetically across the soft rugs, in a game that seemed to involve a great deal of enthusiastic chasing and very little actual rules. She watched them for a moment, smiling despite the uncertainty still lingering from the previous night, before rising to prepare herself for whatever the day within the palace might bring. A servant arrived shortly after, bringing a simple but generous breakfast, along with a message that the king wished to see her in his private study once she had eaten. Elira dressed carefully in the modest clothing she had brought from home, feeling distinctly out of place among the fine silks and polished jewelry she had glimpsed on the noblewomen passing through the palace corridors the previous evening, though she reminded herself firmly that she had earned her place here through courage, not through fine clothing. She followed the servant's directions through winding corridors lined with tall windows and ancient tapestries, the pups trotting eagerly at her heels, until she reached a heavy wooden door, guarded by two silent, watchful guards, who stepped aside respectfully to allow her entry. Inside, Draven sat behind a large desk cluttered with scrolls and maps, his expression grave as he looked up at her arrival. "Good morning," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. "I hope you slept well, despite everything." "Well enough," Elira said, settling into the chair while the pups scattered immediately to investigate the various corners of the unfamiliar study. "You look as though you have not slept at all." "I have not," Draven admitted, rubbing a hand tiredly across his face. "I spent the night reviewing the palace guard rosters from the night my sons disappeared, searching for any inconsistency, any name that should not have had access to the nursery corridor that evening." "Did you find anything?" "Perhaps," Draven said slowly, sliding a scroll across the desk toward her. "One guard, assigned to a post far from the nursery that night, was seen by two separate witnesses walking near the royal wing shortly before dawn. When questioned, he claimed he had simply lost his way, though he has served this palace for over a decade and would know its corridors better than most." "Do you believe him?" "I do not know what to believe," Draven admitted, which is precisely the difficulty of rooting out betrayal within one's own walls. Everyone has an explanation. Everyone claims innocence. I cannot arrest a man on suspicion alone, not without proof strong enough to withstand scrutiny from the entire court. Elira considered this for a long moment, watching Kale attempt, unsuccessfully, to climb onto a low bookshelf across the room. What if you allowed word to spread quietly that the pups had been found, without revealing exactly where they were being kept? Whoever orchestrated their theft would surely grow anxious, knowing their plan had failed. Anxious people make mistakes. Draven's eyes sharpened with interest at her suggestion. "You would have me use my own sons as bait, drawing out whoever seeks to harm them?" "Not bait," Elira corrected quickly. "Only a test. If word spreads that the princes are safely within the palace once more, but their exact location remains uncertain, even to most of the court, whoever was responsible would likely attempt to confirm the rumor, or worse, attempt to finish what they started, before their failure becomes fully known. Watching closely who shows unusual interest in confirming their whereabouts might reveal more than any interrogation could." A slow, thoughtful smile spread across Draven's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since arriving at the palace. "That is remarkably clever, Elira. Perhaps cleverer than half the advisors currently seated on my council." "I have simply learned to notice when something feels wrong," Elira said modestly. "It served me well enough hiding 3 pups beneath a cart full of flowers." "Then let us put your instincts to good use," Draven said, already reaching for a fresh scroll to begin drafting the careful, deliberate rumor that would soon spread quietly through the palace, designed to smoke out whoever still sought to harm his children. Over the following days, The plan unfolded carefully. Whispers began circulating among the servants and courtiers that the missing princes had been found and returned safely to the palace, though their precise location remained deliberately vague, spoken of only in hushed, uncertain tones. Draven kept Alira and the pups moved discreetly between several different chambers each night, never settling long enough in one place for word of their true location to spread with any certainty. Alira found herself growing more comfortable within the palace as the days passed, learning the names of trusted servants, exchanging polite greetings with guards who had grown fond of the pups' playful antics, and slowly beginning to understand the intricate, delicate balance of loyalty and suspicion that governed every relationship within Draven's court. She noticed Haldan's continued watchfulness whenever their paths crossed, his gray eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that never quite settled into open hostility, but never fully relaxed into trust either. "He watches me as though waiting for me to make a mistake," she mentioned to Draven one evening, as they sat together in her chamber, while the pups played nearby. "Haldan watches everyone that way," Draven assured her, though a faint crease of concern touched his brow. "It is simply his nature. He has protected this throne fiercely, since we were both young, and fierce protection sometimes looks very much like suspicion to those unfamiliar with him." Alira accepted his explanation, though something about it did not entirely ease the quiet unease that settled in her stomach whenever Haldan's cold gray eyes found her across a crowded corridor. She said nothing further of it, however, trusting that Draven understood his own court far better than she possibly could, after only a handful of days within its walls. On the 6th night since their arrival at the palace, as a heavy storm rolled in from the northern hills, rattling the windows of Alira's chamber with sudden gusts of wind and rain, a soft, urgent knock sounded at her door, well past the hour when most of the palace had retired for the evening. She opened it cautiously to find one of the guards Draven trusted most, his expression tight with barely controlled alarm. "My lady," he said quickly, "the king requests your presence immediately. There has been movement near the eastern wall, wolves that do not belong to our pack, moving through the storm under cover of darkness." Alira's heart lurched painfully in her chest as she glanced back toward the sleeping pups, curled together peacefully, entirely unaware of the danger that had finally, after days of careful watching and waiting, arrived at the very gates meant to keep them safe. "Stay with them," she told the guard firmly, gesturing toward the small bed where the pups slept. "Do not leave this room for any reason until I return, or until the king himself sends for you." The guard hesitated, clearly torn between his orders to summon her and his instinct to remain at his post, but Alira's steady, commanding tone left little room for argument, and he nodded quickly, stepping fully into the room to stand watch over the sleeping princes, while she hurried out into the storm-swept corridor alone. She found Draven near the eastern battlements, rain soaking through his dark cloak as he stood alongside several of his most trusted guards, all of them peering out into the churning darkness beyond the palace walls where flashes of lightning briefly illuminated shapes moving low and swift through the distant trees. "How many?" Draven demanded of the guard closest to him, his voice sharp with tension. "Difficult to say for certain, Your Majesty," the guard replied, squinting against the driving rain. "Perhaps 6, perhaps more. They move carefully, staying just beyond clear sight, testing our patrols rather than advancing directly." "Scouts," Draven muttered, his jaw tight, confirming what they likely already suspect, that my sons have returned to the palace. Alira reached his side, and he turned briefly at her approach, relief flickering across his rain-streaked features before the grim focus of the moment reclaimed his attention. "You should not be out here," he said, though there was no real command in the words, only worry. "I needed to see for myself," Alira said, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold, biting wind. "What will you do?" "For tonight, nothing beyond watching and waiting," Draven said. "I will not send wolves chasing shadows through a storm this fierce, not when I cannot be certain how many enemies wait hidden beyond what we can see. But this confirms what we suspected. Whoever seeks to harm my sons knows now, or at least strongly suspects, that they are here within these walls." A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating for one brief, startling instant a cluster of shapes at the tree line, tall and lean, unmistakably wolves in their natural form, watching the palace with patient, calculating stillness before the darkness swallowed them once more. Elira's breath caught at the sight, a cold certainty settling over her that the careful, cautious peace of the past several days had finally, irrevocably ended. "They will not attack tonight," Draven said, as though reading the fear plain on her face. "Wolves as disciplined as these do not throw themselves against palace walls without a plan. Tonight was reconnaissance, nothing more. But it tells me our enemy grows bolder, more desperate, which means we have less time than I had hoped to uncover who among my own court continues to aid them." They remained upon the battlements for the better part of an hour, watching the storm rage across the dark hills beyond the palace, before Draven finally ordered the watch doubled and led Elira back inside, away from the biting cold and driving rain. He walked her personally back to her chamber, dismissing the guard who had stood watch over the sleeping pups with quiet thanks, before lingering a moment longer at her door. "I am sorry to have frightened you tonight," he said quietly, rainwater still dripping from the ends of his dark hair. "I would rather know the truth of the danger than remain sheltered from it," Elira said firmly. "I cannot protect your sons properly if I do not understand fully what threatens them." Draven studied her for a long moment, something warm and complicated flickering behind his tired amber eyes. "You continue to remind me why I trusted you with them in the first place," he said softly. "Rest now, if you can. I will post additional guards throughout the night, and I will not rest myself until I am certain this storm, in every sense of the word, has fully passed." He departed reluctantly, and Elira closed her door quietly behind him, sliding the bolt firmly into place before crossing to check on the pups, still sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the wolves that had watched their new home from beyond the tree line only a short while before. She settled herself into the chair beside their small bed, unable to fully release the tension gripping her shoulders, and remained there through the remainder of the storm, watching over them until the first pale light of dawn finally broke through the retreating clouds, carrying with it the uneasy certainty that whatever came next would demand more courage from all of them than anything they had yet faced. 3 days passed after the storm without further sign of the watching wolves, though the tension within the palace remained thick enough to feel in every corridor Elira walked. Guards doubled their patrols along the outer walls, and Draven spent increasingly long hours locked away with Edric and his most trusted commanders, poring over maps and reports in search of any clue that might reveal the identity of the traitor, still hidden somewhere within his own court. Elira kept mostly to her chamber during those tense days, venturing out only for meals or brief walks through the palace gardens with the pups, always accompanied by at least one watchful guard. She noticed the way conversations sometimes quieted when she passed certain groups of courtiers, the way suspicious glances lingered a moment too long, though she tried her best not to let such things trouble her, focusing instead on keeping the pups calm and occupied amid the growing tension surrounding them. On the fourth night, well past midnight, Elira woke suddenly from a light, uneasy sleep, certain that something had disturbed the quiet stillness of her chamber. She lay still for a moment, listening carefully, and heard it again, a faint scraping sound coming from the direction of the window overlooking the palace garden. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping pups, and crossed to the window, peering cautiously through the gap in the heavy curtains. At first she saw nothing beyond the moonlit garden, silent and still beneath the pale silver light. Then a shadow moved near the base of the garden wall, low and swift, followed quickly by a second shadow, then a third, all moving with the same careful, deliberate stealth she had witnessed in the wolves beyond the tree line during the storm. Her heart began to pound violently as she backed away from the window, moving swiftly toward the small silver whistle Draven had given her that first night, kept always within easy reach on the table beside her bed. She lifted it to her lips, prepared to sound the alarm, when the sound of splintering wood erupted from the direction of her chamber door, followed immediately by the guards stationed outside crying out in alarm. Elira did not hesitate. She blew the whistle with every ounce of breath she possessed, the sharp, piercing sound cutting through the night air, before scooping up the nearest pup and hurrying toward the far corner of the room, where a heavy wardrobe offered at least some measure of concealment. Wren and Briar scrambled after her, sensing immediately that something had gone terribly wrong, their earlier sleepy calm replaced by frightened, wide-eyed alertness. The door burst open moments later, and 2 figures entered the chamber, cloaked in dark fabric that obscured their features, moving with the swift, controlled grace of trained wolves. Elira pressed herself and the pups deeper into the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs, when the sound of heavy footsteps and shouting voices erupted suddenly from the corridor beyond, followed almost immediately by Draven himself bursting through the doorway, his eyes blazing with a fury Alira had never witnessed in him before. What followed happened in a blur of swift, controlled movement. Draven moved with a speed that seemed almost impossible, closing the distance to the nearest intruder before the cloaked figure could fully turn to face him, disarming him with practiced efficiency, and forcing him to the ground with an overwhelming show of strength that left no doubt about the true power hidden beneath his usually calm exterior. Guards flooded into the room moments later, quickly subduing the second intruder, before he could reach the corner where Alira still huddled protectively over the pups. "Alira," Draven called out sharply, his voice tight with barely restrained fear. "Are you harmed? Are they harmed?" "We are safe," Alira managed, her voice shaking, despite her best efforts to steady it. Frightened, but safe. Relief flooded across Draven's features as he crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside her and running a careful, searching gaze over each of the pups before finally meeting her eyes. "Thank the moon," he murmured, his hand briefly resting against her shoulder, warm and grounding, amid the chaos still swirling through the chamber, as guards secured the two captured intruders and began questioning them roughly, though neither seemed willing to speak. "Take them to the lower chambers," Draven ordered his guards, rising to his feet with renewed authority, despite the tremor of fear that had briefly cracked his composure. "I will question them myself, once I am certain my family is fully secure." The guards dragged the two intruders away, their hoods finally slipping back during the struggle, to reveal faces unfamiliar to Alira, though she noticed Edric's sharp intake of breath as he arrived at the doorway moments later, his expression grim with dawning recognition. "You know them," Draven said, catching the flicker of recognition on his advisor's face. "I have seen them before, Your Majesty," Edric admitted slowly. "Among Haldan's personal guard. I did not realize they had been reassigned recently, but I will confirm it immediately." A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the room at Edric's words, and Alira watched Draven's expression shift from relief into something colder, harder, the full weight of betrayal beginning to settle over him, as the pieces of a conspiracy he had feared, but not wanted to believe, began, finally, to take clearer shape. "Bring Haldan to me," Draven said quietly, though the quiet command carried more danger within it than any shout could have managed. "Now." Alira rose slowly from the corner, gathering the still trembling pups close against her, as guards hurried to carry out the king's order, and though the immediate danger of the attack itself had passed, she understood, with growing certainty, that the true confrontation still waiting ahead of them would prove far more dangerous than anything they had yet endured. Haldan arrived within the chamber a short while later, flanked by two guards, his expression carefully composed, despite the tension evident in the room around him. His cold gray eyes swept briefly over Alira and the pups before settling on Draven, betraying nothing beyond mild, practiced concern. "Your Majesty, I came as soon as I heard," Haldan said smoothly. "Is everyone unharmed? The two wolves who broke into this chamber tonight were seen among your personal guard," Draven said, his voice deceptively calm, despite the fury simmering visibly beneath the surface. "Explain to me, cousin, how enemies of my throne came to serve under your command." Haldan's expression flickered, just briefly, a fraction of surprise or perhaps calculation, crossing his features before his composure reasserted itself. "I assure you, Your Majesty, I have no knowledge of any such treachery among my ranks. If they were indeed my guards, then someone must have turned them against us without my awareness." "Convenient," Draven said coldly. "That treachery keeps finding its way so close to you, cousin, without your awareness." "You cannot possibly believe I would harm my own family," Haldan said, a sharp edge finally entering his voice. "I have protected this throne for over a decade, Draven. I would not throw away everything I have built for some reckless scheme against your own sons." The two men stared at one another across the tense chamber, old history and new suspicion colliding visibly between them, while Alira watched from the corner, holding the frightened pups close, understanding with growing unease that whatever truth lay hidden beneath this dangerous confrontation, it would not come easily, and it would not come without further cost, before this conspiracy finally, fully unraveled. "You will remain within the palace, under guard, until this matter is fully resolved," Draven said finally, his tone allowing no room for negotiation. Not as a prisoner, cousin, but as a precaution, until I can be certain of where your loyalties truly stand. Halden's jaw tightened, a flash of anger crossing his features before he mastered it, inclining his head stiffly in reluctant agreement. As you wish, your majesty. Though I hope, for the sake of our family, that this suspicion proves misplaced. As do I, Draven said quietly, though his eyes remained hard, unconvinced, as Halden turned and departed the chamber flanked by his silent guards. Once he had gone, Draven ordered the two captured intruders questioned separately by his most trusted interrogators, though word returned before dawn that both had been trained to resist such questioning, offering only silence or carefully rehearsed denials, no matter how the guards pressed them. Whoever had recruited them had chosen carefully, ensuring that even capture would yield little useful information to trace the conspiracy back to its true source. They will not talk easily, Edric reported grimly as the first light of morning crept through the palace windows. Whoever trained them understood exactly what they were sending into that chamber tonight, and prepared them thoroughly for the possibility of failure. Then we will need patience, Draven said wearily, though frustration simmered plainly beneath his exhausted tone. Continue questioning them, gently at first, and watch closely for any inconsistency in their stories. Someone recruited them, paid them, gave them instructions detailed enough to nearly succeed. That person left some trace, however small, and I intend to find it. Illyra remained in her chamber through the early hours of the morning, the pups finally settling back into an uneasy sleep once the chaos of the attack had fully passed, though she herself found rest impossible, her mind circling endlessly around the night's terrifying events. She thought of Halden's cold composure, of the flicker of something unreadable that had crossed his face when accused, and found herself uncertain whether she had witnessed the calm of an innocent man wrongly suspected, or the careful control of someone skilled at hiding guilt behind practiced calm. Draven arrived at her door shortly after sunrise, his exhaustion plain in the heaviness of his steps, and the shadows deepening beneath his amber eyes. Illyra opened the door to let him in, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the events of the night settling heavily between them in the quiet morning light. I nearly lost them tonight, Draven said finally, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. Nearly lost you as well. I promised you safety within these walls, Illyra, and instead, I brought you closer to the very danger I meant to protect you from. You did not bring this danger, Illyra said firmly, crossing the room to stand before him. Whoever orchestrated it would have found a way regardless of where the pups were kept. At least here, within these walls, we had guards close enough to respond before real harm was done. That is generous of you to say, Draven murmured, though I do not know that I deserve such generosity, after the fear I saw in your eyes tonight. Fear does not undo courage, Illyra said gently. I was afraid, yes, but I was also prepared, because you gave me the means to call for help, and because I trusted that help would come. It did. That trust was not misplaced. Draven studied her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing behind his tired eyes, before he reached out slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fierce, controlled power she had witnessed him wield, only hours before, against the intruders in her chamber. I do not know what I would have done, he said quietly, if I had arrived tonight to find you, or my sons harmed. I have faced enemies on many battlefields, Illyra, faced down rival packs and ambitious challengers to my throne, without ever feeling the fear that gripped me the moment I heard that whistle sound through the storm. But you did arrive in time, Illyra said softly, and we are safe. That is what matters now. For tonight, Draven said, the weight of unresolved danger still evident in his tired voice. But until I know for certain who sent those wolves into your chamber, I cannot promise such safety will hold indefinitely. They stood together in comfortable, weighted silence for a long moment, the early morning light strengthening gradually through the windows, illuminating the exhaustion and quiet tenderness passing between them in equal measure. Finally, Draven stepped back, though reluctance colored the motion, duty pulling him once more toward the demands of his throne, even as something else, something warmer and more personal, seemed to pull him toward remaining exactly where he stood. I must return to the interrogations, he said finally. Rest if you can, Illyra. I will post additional guards directly outside your door. Wolves I trust with absolute certainty. until this matter is resolved. Be careful, Illyra said as he moved toward the door. Whoever orchestrated tonight's attack knows now that it failed. They may grow more desperate, not less. I intend to be very careful indeed, Draven said grimly, pausing at the threshold to glance back at her one final time. Careful enough to ensure that whoever betrayed this family never has another opportunity to try again. He departed, leaving Illyra alone once more, with the sleeping pups, the morning sun climbing steadily higher beyond her windows, casting warm golden light across a chamber that had, only hours before, been the scene of violence and fear. She settled beside the pups, watching over their peaceful sleep, and allowed herself finally, briefly, to feel the full weight of everything that had happened since the terrifying moment she discovered them hidden beneath her flowers, grateful beyond words that all three remained safe, yet acutely aware that the true source of the danger threatening them still remained hidden, waiting patiently for its next opportunity to strike. The following days brought a tense, watchful quiet to the palace, as Draven's interrogators continued their careful questioning of the captured intruders, while guards doubled their patrols throughout every corridor and courtyard within the palace walls. Halden remained confined to his own quarters under guard, his composed dignity never fully cracking, despite the suspicion surrounding him. Though Illyra noticed the way courtiers whispered behind their hands whenever his name arose, the delicate balance of loyalty within the court shifting visibly beneath the weight of uncertainty. Illyra found herself drawn increasingly into the quiet, careful work of watching, listening, and piecing together fragments of information that might otherwise have gone unnoticed by those too consumed by court politics to see clearly. She began noticing small details that seemed insignificant on their own. A particular guard who always seemed to know more than he should about matters far above his station. A servant who lingered too long near doorways where important conversations took place. A pattern of small, seemingly unrelated coincidences that, taken together, began to suggest a web of loyalty and betrayal, far more complicated than anyone within the palace had yet realized. She said nothing of her growing suspicions to Draven at first, uncertain whether her observations held any true significance, or whether exhaustion and lingering fear had simply made her see danger in every shadow. But as the days passed and the pieces continued to accumulate in her mind, she understood, with growing certainty, that she alone might hold the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had eluded even the most experienced minds within Draven's own court. Life within the palace settled into a new, uneasy rhythm over the following week, one shaped by careful vigilance rather than the open fear that had gripped the corridors immediately after the attack. Illyra spent her mornings with the pups in the private garden reserved for the royal family, watching them grow steadily bolder and more coordinated in their small wolf forms, chasing butterflies and tumbling through beds of fragrant herbs, while trusted guards watched discreetly from the garden's edges. Draven joined them whenever his duties allowed, and Illyra noticed how these quiet moments in the garden seemed to restore something in him that the endless demands of his throne steadily wore away. He laughed more freely there, chased Kale across the grass with an easy warmth that seemed impossible to reconcile with the fierce, commanding king she had witnessed subduing intruders only days before, and Illyra found herself treasuring these small pockets of peace, all the more for how fragile and temporary they felt. "You seem different here," she observed one afternoon, watching him wrestle gently with Briar among the flower beds. "Lighter, somehow." "This garden was my mother's favorite place in the entire palace," Draven said, settling onto the grass beside Illyra, as Briar continued his determined assault on a fallen twig. "She used to say that a king who never remembered how to simply exist, without the weight of his crown pressing down on every moment, would eventually lose himself entirely to the demands of ruling. She sounds wise." "She was," Draven said softly. "I try to remember her lessons, though it grows more difficult with each passing year, especially now, surrounded by suspicion and betrayal at every turn." Illyra reached over, resting her hand gently on his arm, and he turned to meet her gaze, something warm and unguarded passing between them in the golden afternoon light. Neither spoke for a long moment, though the silence carried a weight and meaning that words might have only diminished. "Thank you," Draven said finally, "for reminding me, even in the middle of all this danger, that moments like this one still matter." Their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed within the palace, and Alira found herself the subject of increasing curiosity among the courtiers she passed each day. Some regarded her with open warmth, grateful servants and guards who had watched her tireless care for the young princes and recognized the genuine affection binding her to the small family. Others remained coolly distant, whispering behind carefully composed expressions about the strange, unprecedented closeness developing between their king and a human woman of no noble birth. "Pay them no mind," Draven told her one evening, when she mentioned the whispers that had followed her through the eastern corridor that afternoon. "Court gossip feeds on anything unfamiliar. It will pass, once they see for themselves the depth of your character."
"And if it does not pass?"
Alira asked.
"If your court never accepts a human woman standing so close to their king?"
Draven considered the question seriously, his expression thoughtful in the flickering candlelight of her chamber. "Then they will need to learn to accept it," he said simply, "because I do not intend to let their narrow assumptions dictate who I choose to trust, or who I choose to care for." The warmth of his words settled deep within Alira's chest, though she said nothing further, uncertain how to voice the complicated tangle of emotions steadily growing within her, regarding this powerful, unexpected man who had entered her life so suddenly and so completely reshaped its course. Meanwhile, the investigation into the failed attack continued its slow, careful progress. Edric reported that one of the captured intruders had finally begun to show small signs of wavering under careful, patient questioning, though he had not yet revealed anything definitive about who had ultimately commanded the scheme against the young princes. Halden remained confined to his quarters, his composed dignity slowly giving way to visible frustration as the days of suspicion stretched longer without resolution. Alira continued her own quiet observations throughout this period, noting carefully the movements and conversations that seemed slightly out of place within the palace's usual rhythms. She began keeping a small, private record of her observations, tucked carefully within the pages of a book she kept beside her bed, unwilling to share her still-forming suspicions until she felt more certain of their significance. One evening, while walking the pups through a quieter section of the palace gardens as dusk settled softly over the grounds, she overheard two servants speaking in low, urgent tones near a hedge of tall rose bushes, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch fragments of their conversation before they noticed her approach and fell abruptly silent. "Before the next full moon, or the whole plan collapses entirely. She asks too many questions already, the flower woman. If she continues digging." The servants noticed Alira's approach a moment later, quickly straightening and offering hurried, nervous greetings before departing swiftly in opposite directions, leaving Alira standing alone among the roses, with her heart pounding and her mind racing through the implications of what she had just overheard. Someone within the palace, someone close enough to know of her growing suspicions, had noticed her quiet investigation, and the mention of a deadline tied to the next full moon suggested a plan still very much in motion, one that had not ended with the failed attack on her chamber. She gathered the pups quickly and hurried back toward her rooms, her thoughts spinning with newfound urgency. Whatever conspiracy threatened Draven's throne and his sons, it was not finished, and now, it seemed, she herself had become enough of a threat to the conspirators that they had begun speaking of her by name, even if only in careful, guarded whispers exchanged behind rose bushes in a quiet corner of the palace garden. She needed to speak with Draven immediately, before whoever plotted against his family found the opportunity to silence the flower seller who had already proven, twice now, that she possessed both the courage and the sharp instincts necessary to stand firmly in their way. She found him in his study, still bent over the same scrolls and reports that seemed to occupy nearly every waking hour he could spare from his other duties. He looked up immediately at the urgency in her expression, rising from his chair before she had even fully crossed the threshold. "What happened?" he asked, closing the distance between them quickly. Alira recounted the overheard conversation, as precisely as she could remember it, watching Draven's expression darken with each word, his hands curling slowly into fists at his sides, as the implications settled over him. "They spoke of the next full moon," he repeated slowly. "That is only 5 nights from now. And they spoke of me by name, or near enough to it," Alira said. "Whoever is behind this knows that I have been watching, asking questions, piecing together small details. They see me as a threat to whatever they still intend to do." "Then you are in more danger than I realized," Draven said grimly, already moving toward the door to summon Edric and his most trusted guards. I should have insisted on stationing a guard with you at all times, rather than allowing you the freedom to walk the gardens unaccompanied. I do not want to live locked away behind guards for the rest of my time here, Alira said firmly, though she understood the fear driving his reaction. But I agree, we cannot ignore what I heard. Something is planned for the next full moon, and if we do nothing, we may lose whatever advantage surprise still offers us. Edric arrived within minutes, listening carefully, as Draven relayed what Alira had overheard, his weathered face growing increasingly troubled, as the pieces began aligning with fragments of information his own investigation had slowly gathered over the preceding days. The full moon holds significance beyond simple timing, Your Majesty, Edric said thoughtfully. It is traditionally the night when pack loyalties are renewed publicly, when lesser wolves swear their allegiance before the assembled court. If someone intended to seize power, or challenge your claim to the throne, there could be no more symbolic moment to act. A public challenge, Draven murmured, understanding dawning slowly across his features. If they mean to move against me during the full moon ceremony, in front of the entire court, they would need overwhelming certainty of success, or overwhelming support, already secured among those attending. Which means, Alira said slowly, following the thread of logic to its natural conclusion, that whoever plans this has already convinced a significant number of your court to support them, or to remain silent when the moment comes. A heavy, uneasy silence fell over the study, as the full weight of the danger settled over all three of them. If the conspiracy against Draven's throne had grown large enough to risk open challenge during so public and sacred a ceremony, then the threat facing them extended far beyond a handful of hired intruders, or a single suspected traitor confined to his quarters. It suggested a fracture running deep through the very foundation of Draven's kingdom, one that had been growing, unnoticed, for far longer than anyone had realized. We must proceed carefully, Draven said finally, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. If we move too openly against suspected conspirators before the full moon, we risk driving them to act sooner, perhaps before we are fully prepared to counter them. But if we do nothing, we risk being caught entirely unprepared when the moment finally arrives. Then let us prepare quietly, Alira suggested. Continue watching, continue gathering what information we can, but also make certain your most loyal wolves are ready to act the moment the ceremony begins, should anyone attempt what we now suspect they are planning. Draven nodded slowly, a grim determination settling over his exhausted features. Edric, double the guard discreetly around the ceremony grounds, but instruct them to remain unseen until needed. I want no outward sign that we suspect anything, not until the moment demands it. And Alira, he added, turning toward her with unmistakable concern, you will not walk anywhere within this palace unaccompanied again, not until this threat has been fully resolved. I understand your desire for freedom, but I cannot risk losing you to whatever desperation drives these conspirators, now that they see you as an obstacle to their plans. Alira wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could continue her careful observations more effectively, without a guard trailing her every step, drawing unwanted attention to her movements. But the fierce protectiveness in Draven's amber eyes, the memory of intruders bursting into her chamber only days before, convinced her that this was not a battle worth fighting. Very well, she agreed, but let me continue helping however I can, from within whatever boundaries you set. I have not come this far, only to sit quietly in my chamber, while the fate of your throne, and the safety of your sons, hangs in the balance. I would not dream of asking you to sit quietly, Draven said, the faintest hint of a smile touching his tired features, despite the tension gripping the room. You have proven far too valuable an ally for that, Alira. Whatever comes on the night of the full moon, I intend to face it with you standing beside me, not hidden away behind locked doors. As the meeting drew to a close, and Edric departed to begin quietly arranging the additional security measures Draven had ordered, Alira found herself gazing out the study window toward the darkening sky, where the moon hung still mostly full, growing rounder and brighter with each passing night, counting down steadily toward the dangerous confrontation that all of them now understood was rapidly approaching, whether they felt fully prepared for it or not. The 5 days leading up to the full moon ceremony passed in a haze of careful preparation and mounting tension. Alira continued caring for the pups as she had every day since arriving at the palace, though now a quiet guard remained always within sight, discreet but ever present, a constant reminder of the danger still coiled somewhere within the palace walls, waiting for its moment to strike. Draven grew increasingly withdrawn as the ceremony approached, spending long hours in private conference with Edric and a small circle of commanders he trusted absolutely, finalizing plans that he shared only in careful, measured fragments with Alira, unwilling to risk her safety by burdening her with knowledge that might make her a greater target should the conspirators grow desperate enough to move against her directly. Halden remained confined to his quarters throughout this period, and Alira noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor during the rare occasions their paths crossed in the corridors. The cool composure that had defined him since her arrival at the palace had given way to something more brittle, a barely contained frustration that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of his carefully maintained dignity. "He grows impatient," Draven observed one evening, watching from a distance as guards escorted Halden back toward his quarters, following a brief, supervised walk through the eastern gardens. "Innocent men grow impatient with unjust suspicion. Guilty men grow impatient watching their carefully laid plans slip further from their control. I confess, even now, I cannot say with certainty which describes my cousin." "The ceremony will tell us soon enough," Alira said, though uncertainty colored her own voice as well. The night of the full moon arrived with a clear, cold sky, stars scattered thick and bright above the palace grounds, as servants prepared the great ceremonial courtyard for the ancient ritual that would soon unfold. Alira dressed carefully, in a gown Draven had gifted her for the occasion, deep silver fabric that shimmered faintly in the torchlight, and made her way toward the courtyard with the pups walking proudly at her side, their small forms groomed and adorned with delicate silver collars, marking their royal status for the assembled court to see. The courtyard filled steadily with wolves from every corner of Draven's kingdom, nobles and commoners alike gathering beneath the rising moon to witness the ancient ceremony of renewed loyalty. Alira felt the weight of countless curious and suspicious glances as she took her place near the raised dais, where Draven would soon stand to receive his court's oaths, though she held her chin high, refusing to let their scrutiny shake the calm resolve she had carefully built over the preceding days. Draven ascended the dais as the moon reached its full height above the courtyard, his presence commanding immediate silence from the assembled crowd. He spoke the traditional words of the ceremony with practiced authority, calling forward representatives from each noble house to renew their sworn allegiance beneath the ancient light that had witnessed countless such ceremonies throughout generations of his family's rule. The ceremony proceeded smoothly through its early stages, noble after noble stepping forward to kneel and speak their oaths, until finally Edric called forward Halden, still confined by guard but permitted, by ancient tradition, to renew his own oath before the court, despite the suspicion surrounding him. Halden ascended the dais slowly, his expression carefully composed, though Alira noticed the tension coiled tightly beneath his controlled movements. He knelt before Draven, beginning the traditional words of the oath in a steady, clear voice that carried across the silent, watching courtyard. It was in the middle of his recitation that everything changed. A commotion erupted suddenly near the eastern edge of the courtyard, guards crying out in alarm as a group of cloaked figures burst forward from among the assembled crowd, weapons drawn, moving with the coordinated speed of wolves who had planned this moment carefully. Screams rose from the gathered nobles as chaos rippled outward through the courtyard, and Alira instinctively pulled the pups close against her, her heart hammering violently, as guards Draven had positioned discreetly throughout the crowd surged forward to meet the sudden threat. But it was not Halden who rose to lead the attackers, as Alira had half expected in the chaotic first moments of the ambush. Instead, she watched in stunned disbelief, as Edric himself, the trusted advisor who had served Draven's family for decades, stepped forward from behind the dais, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across features that had, until this very moment, seemed the very picture of loyal devotion. "Edric?" Draven's voice cracked with disbelief, as he turned to face the man he had trusted implicitly since childhood. "You? All this time? It was you?" "You always trusted the wrong people, Draven," Edric said, his voice carrying a bitterness that had clearly festered for years beneath his composed exterior. "You trusted a cousin whose loyalty you constantly questioned, while never once suspecting the advisor who stood beside you every single day, whispering counsel you never thought to doubt." "Why?" Draven demanded, his voice tight with fury and betrayal in equal measure. After everything my family has given you, everything we built together? Given me? Edric spat, his composed facade finally cracking entirely, to reveal the resentment simmering beneath years of careful service. I gave your father 30 years of loyal counsel, and what did I receive in return? A comfortable title, and the eternal privilege of serving a bloodline that will always see me as beneath them, no matter how faithfully I serve. I grew tired of building a throne I could never sit upon, Draven. I decided it was time to build one of my own instead, with your sons removed from the succession entirely, and a court too fractured by suspicion to unite against me, before I could seize what I had earned. You used my own family's suspicion of Halden as cover, Draven said slowly, the full scope of the betrayal settling over him. You planted the guards near the nursery, then ensured suspicion fell upon him, all while continuing your true plan uninterrupted. A useful distraction, Edric agreed coldly. Though I confess, I did not anticipate a simple flower seller proving clever enough to nearly unravel everything before I was fully prepared to act. His gaze shifted toward Alira, cold and calculating, and she felt Draven's entire body tense beside her, a low, dangerous growl building in his throat as he moved instinctively to place himself between Edric and the woman and Pups he had sworn to protect. You will not touch them, Draven said, his voice dropping into something primal and lethal that Alira had never heard from him before. I do not need to touch them, Edric said, gesturing toward the chaos still unfolding throughout the courtyard as guards clashed with the cloaked conspirators who had emerged at his signal. I need only enough chaos to ensure that when the dust settles, your throne stands empty and your line ends here, tonight, beneath this very moon that has watched your family rule for far too long. But even as Edric spoke, Alira noticed something he apparently had not accounted for. The guards Draven had positioned so carefully throughout the crowd were already gaining the upper hand against the conspirators, trained and prepared for exactly this kind of ambush, while nobles who had sworn genuine loyalty moments before now rallied instinctively to their king's defense, rather than standing passively by, as Edric had clearly hoped. You overestimated your support, old friend, Draven said grimly, watching as his loyal wolves steadily overwhelmed the scattered conspirators throughout the courtyard. And you underestimated the woman you just called a simple flower seller. Edric's confident expression finally faltered as he glanced around the courtyard, realizing with dawning horror that his carefully planned coup was collapsing rapidly around him, his conspirators falling one by one to guards who had anticipated exactly this moment, thanks to the careful, patient preparation Alira's overheard warning had made possible. He turned to flee, but Halden, still kneeling nearby where he had been forced to pause his interrupted oath, rose swiftly and intercepted him before he could take more than a few steps, tackling the fleeing advisor to the ground with the same fierce, protective loyalty toward the throne that had defined him throughout the entire ordeal, suspicion and all. I told you, Halden growled, pinning Edric firmly against the stone ground, that I would never betray this family. Draven moved quickly to secure Edric properly, ordering guards to bind him thoroughly, while the last of the scattered conspirators were rounded up throughout the courtyard, the chaos of the ambush finally giving way to the exhausted, relieved quiet of a threat successfully overcome. He turned immediately toward Alira and the Pups, relief and lingering fury warring plainly across his features as he confirmed with his own eyes that all four remained unharmed. It is over, he said quietly, pulling Alira and the Pups into a fierce, protective embrace amid the settling chaos of the courtyard. Truly over, this time. Alira allowed herself finally to release the breath she had been holding throughout the entire terrifying confrontation, the Pups pressing close against her legs as Draven's strong arms wrapped securely around all of them, and for the first time since discovering 3 trembling pups hidden beneath her flowers so many days before, she felt the true, complete relief of knowing that the danger, at last, had finally passed. Guards led the bound Edric away toward the lower chambers amid a stunned, murmuring silence from the assembled court. Nobles, who had known him for decades, exchanging shocked, disbelieving glances as the full weight of his betrayal settled over the courtyard. Draven watched him go with an expression that mixed grief and fury in equal measure, the pain of discovering such deep treachery from a man he had trusted since childhood, clearly cutting far deeper than any physical wound could have managed. I am sorry, Halden said quietly, approaching Draven once the immediate chaos had settled. his earlier cool composure replaced now by something more open, more vulnerable than Alira had yet seen from him. I should have pressed harder to prove my innocence, rather than accepting confinement so readily. Perhaps if I had insisted on investigating alongside your guards, we might have uncovered Edric's treachery sooner. You did nothing wrong, cousin, Draven said, clasping Halden's forearm firmly in a gesture of renewed trust and gratitude. You accepted suspicion with dignity, and tonight you proved beyond any doubt where your true loyalty lies. I owe you an apology, not the reverse, for ever doubting you so deeply. You had reason for caution, Halden said, a faint, weary smile touching his features for the first time since Alira had arrived at the palace. A king who does not question those closest to him leaves himself vulnerable to exactly the kind of betrayal we uncovered tonight. I only wish it had not taken so long to see the truth clearly. Draven turned then toward Alira, his expression softening considerably as he studied her carefully in the moonlight, checking once more for any sign of harm, despite her earlier assurances. You saved us tonight, he said quietly. Had you not overheard that conversation in the garden, had you not trusted your instincts enough to bring it to me, despite how uncertain you must have felt, Edric's plan might well have succeeded before we ever suspected the true danger we faced. I only did what felt right, Alira said, though warmth spread through her chest at the sincerity in his voice. You are the one who prepared your guards, who trusted my instincts enough to act on them despite how little proof I truly had to offer. We accomplished this together, Draven said firmly, as we have accomplished everything, since the moment you chose to hide 3 frightened pups beneath your flowers, rather than turning them over to strangers. The following days brought a slow, careful process of restoring order to Draven's court, as guards continued questioning the captured conspirators, uncovering gradually the full extent of Edric's carefully constructed scheme. It emerged that he had spent years quietly cultivating resentment among a small circle of ambitious nobles who felt overlooked by the current line of succession, promising each of them positions of power once his coup succeeded, while carefully ensuring that suspicion, when it inevitably arose, would fall upon Halden rather than himself. Edric's punishment was decided according to the ancient laws of Draven's kingdom, laws that Alira did not fully understand in their particulars, but recognized carried the full weight of a betrayal so severe, it threatened the very foundation of the throne itself. Draven spoke little of the specifics with her, though she saw the heavy toll it took on him nonetheless, the grief of losing a man he had once considered nearly a second father, settling deep into the quiet moments, when he believed no one was watching him closely. Alira found herself a constant, steady presence throughout this difficult period, offering quiet comfort during the evenings, when the weight of his throne pressed most heavily upon him, sitting beside him in comfortable silence, while the pups played nearby, oblivious to the gravity of the events that had so recently threatened to tear their small family apart entirely. Thank you, Draven said one evening, as they sat together watching the pups tumble happily across the floor of her chamber, the terror of the full moon ceremony now several days behind them. Not only for what you did that night, but for everything since. I do not know that I could have carried this burden so steadily without you beside me. You are not carrying it alone, Alira said softly, reaching for his hand. Not anymore. Draven turned his hand to intertwine his fingers with hers, the same gesture they had shared weeks before beside her cottage fire, though it carried now a weight and certainty that had not existed then, forged through danger endured together, and trust proven beyond any doubt. Alira, he said quietly, his amber eyes serious and searching in the soft candlelight, I find myself increasingly unable to imagine this palace, or my life within it, without you standing beside me. I do not say this lightly, nor do I say it simply out of gratitude for everything you have done to protect my sons. Alira's heart quickened at the depth of emotion evident in his voice, though she said nothing yet, allowing him the space to finish whatever he had clearly been building toward saying for some time. I have ruled this kingdom for many years, believing that duty and love could never truly coexist within the demands of a throne, Draven continued. You have shown me, through every difficult moment we have faced together, that perhaps I was wrong to believe such a thing. Whatever comes next, Alira, I would very much like for you to remain here, not simply as the protector of my sons, but as someone far closer to my heart than I ever anticipated allowing anyone to become again. The pups, sensing perhaps the significance of the moment despite their young age, quieted their playful tumbling, to watch curiously as Alira leaned forward, closing the remaining distance between herself and Draven. Her answer carried more clearly in the gentle certainty of her touch than any words could have expressed. Weeks passed following the dramatic unraveling of Edric's betrayal, and slowly, steadily, the palace began to heal from the wounds of conspiracy and suspicion that had gripped it for so long. Halden resumed his duties as commander of the royal guard with renewed vigor, his loyalty now beyond any doubt among the court, and he and Draven grew closer than they had been in years, the old suspicion between them replaced by a deep, hard-won trust forged through shared danger. Alira found herself settling ever more comfortably into her new life within the palace, though she never fully lost the habits and simple pleasures of the woman she had been, before 3 wolf pups changed the entire course of her existence. She continued tending a small garden within the palace grounds, growing roses and lilies and violets much as she had behind her modest cottage, and she often spent quiet mornings there with the pups, now growing steadily larger and more confident with each passing week, tumbling happily among the flower beds she tended, with the same careful patience her mother had taught her so many years before. Kale remained the boldest of the 3, forever the first to investigate new corners of the palace grounds, or challenge his siblings to increasingly ambitious games. Ren continued observing quietly before joining in, though he had grown notably more playful and affectionate since the danger surrounding their early days had finally passed. Briar remained the gentlest of the 3, content to curl contentedly in Alira's lap during quiet afternoons, seemingly unbothered by the more energetic antics of his siblings. Word of Draven's growing affection for the human woman who had saved his sons spread gradually throughout the kingdom, and though some among the more traditional nobility continued to view the match with quiet reservation, the overwhelming sentiment among both wolves and humans who heard the story was one of genuine warmth and admiration. Stories began circulating throughout the marketplaces and villages of the kingdom, tales of a simple flower seller whose courage and kindness had saved the throne's young heirs and ultimately captured the heart of the Alpha King himself. On a clear evening several months after the full moon ceremony that had so nearly ended in disaster, Draven called together the entire court within the grand ceremonial hall, the same ancient space where generations of his family had celebrated their most significant occasions. Alira stood beside him on the raised dais, wearing a gown of deep blue that seemed to shimmer like the night sky itself, while the 3 pups, now grown considerably larger and more composed, sat proudly at their feet. Many of you have watched these past months unfold with curiosity, and in some cases, with doubt, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, attentive hall. You have watched a human woman enter our world under the most unusual circumstances imaginable, and you have watched her prove, time and again, a courage and loyalty that few among even our own kind could rightfully claim to match. He turned toward Alira, taking her hand gently in his own, before facing the assembled court once more. Tonight, I wish to make plain before all of you what has already grown clear within my own heart. Alira did not simply save my sons through fortunate circumstance. She chose, again and again, at considerable risk to herself, to protect them, to protect this family, and ultimately, to protect this entire kingdom from a betrayal that might otherwise have torn it apart entirely. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the gathered nobles as Draven knelt before Alira, an act of humility rarely witnessed from a king before his own court, drawing a small, ornately carved box from within his cloak. Alira, he said, his amber eyes steady and sincere, despite the weight of so many watching eyes upon them. I ask you before my entire court, before my sons, and before the ancient traditions of my people, to become not simply the protector of these young princes, but my mate, my equal, and my partner in every sense that matters, for as long as the moon continues to rise above these hills. Alira felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes as she looked down at this powerful king, feared and respected throughout an entire kingdom, kneeling before her with nothing but open, genuine love shining plainly in his expression. She thought of the frightened woman who had discovered 3 trembling pups hidden beneath her flowers so many months before, uncertain of what the day would bring, and marveled quietly at how completely her simple, ordinary life had transformed since that fateful morning. Yes, she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed waiting hall. Yes, I will. The hall erupted into genuine, joyful celebration, as Draven rose to sweep her into his arms. The assembled court, whatever reservations some among them had once harbored, now joining wholeheartedly in the celebration of a union that had clearly been forged through courage, sacrifice, and a love that had proven itself far stronger than any doubt or tradition could diminish. The pups, sensing the joy surrounding them, added their own excited barks to the celebration, weaving happily between the legs of nobles who laughed warmly at their enthusiasm. In the weeks that followed, Elira made one final visit to her old cottage on the quiet street where her entire remarkable journey had begun. She walked slowly through the small, familiar rooms, running her fingers along the worn wooden table where she had once shared tea with a mysterious hooded stranger, standing quietly beside the hearth where 3 frightened pups had first found warmth and safety within her care. Her flower cart remained exactly where she had left it, tucked away in the small shed behind her cottage, its wooden wheels slightly worn from years of faithful service, carrying her modest livelihood through the market square each day. She ran her hand gently along its familiar surface, remembering the desperate courage of that first morning, the weight of the decision that had ultimately reshaped not only her own life, but the fate of an entire kingdom. She did not need the cart any longer, not in the way she once had, but she could not bring herself to abandon it entirely either. This simple, humble object that had carried far more than flowers, on the morning 3 wolf pups chose to hide within its depths. She arranged instead for it to be transported carefully back to the palace, where it found a new home within the royal gardens, filled once more with fresh flowers she tended personally each week, a quiet, humble reminder, amid the grandeur of palace life, of exactly where her extraordinary journey had truly begun. Years later, when Kale, Wren, and Briar had grown into strong, capable young wolves preparing to take their own places within their father's court, they would often ask Elira to tell them once more the story of the morning she found them hidden beneath her flowers, trembling and afraid, uncertain of what the world beyond their small hiding place might hold for them. And each time, Elira would smile, gathering her now-grown sons close, despite their protests that they were far too old for such affection, and remind them gently that even the smallest, most frightened creatures could find safety in unexpected kindness, and that sometimes the most ordinary people, armed with nothing more than courage and a cart full of flowers, could change the entire course of a kingdom's future. The flower cart remained in the royal garden for many years afterward, tended lovingly by the queen who had once been nothing more than a humble seller of roses and lilies, standing always as a quiet testament to the day courage, kindness, and an unexpected love had bloomed together beneath the petals of a simple bouquet, and never once wilted, no matter how many seasons passed.